Hello, everyone. I am the true scary storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you are using this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching right now? Get comfortable and relax. I missed the scorching wind of Andalusia, how it pours sunlight onto your face, toying with eyelashes, flattening dry sand against cheeks, and milling around hair. I missed the smell of the valley, and that ripening softness of musket fluff glistening in the afternoon breeze. From up here, I can see the house where I grew up. I see white chapels tucked into grape orchards like pawns scattered on a chessboard. I can see patches of asphalt on El Jardinito Road, hailing from the old town through dappled rocks, then waning behind the horizon with erratic headlights of beat-up trucks cruising along. One of the pit stops along El Jardinito, where truck drivers stop to relieve themselves, marks the starting point to this wavy trail, all covered in blotches of spindly grass stalks and flaxen sand. The trail is barely noticeable at first. The truth is, no one even cares to notice it. Why would truckers taking a blitzly care to check on a mucky trail leading to God knows where? But I do. This is how I got up here to the top of this hill where I am standing now. I've climbed all the way up here so I can finally end it all. All these years of vagrancy and fugue, exile and fear. This is where it's all going to come to an end. But for now, I am enjoying the view of the valley unfolding below. I am sipping the air of what could be my final memories. He will show up soon. He always does. Like a shadow he's been following. Me right in my footsteps, always there behind me. And there he is. His limping figure appears behind the sharp bend off El Jardinito. He looks up and he sees me, then stops for a moment to catch his breath and leans on his cane, as if assessing the remaining trajectory for this final stretch, then resumes his walk. Or should I say, resumes his agonizing trudging. Years of endless chase took a toll on his body. No wonder. How long has he been chasing me? 10, 20, 30 years? He is slow, methodically slow. But for once, I will not run. I will wait. Right here, behind this rock. I will finally come face with him. This sharp Swiss knife blade I am holding in my hand will soon lance right through his neck bone. Yes, that's what I am going to do. This ends here, at the dead end of this sandy trail atop the hill overlooking the valley with its white chapels and musket orchards. Funny, after all these years, I still don't know the real name of my chaser. I always called him what Master Borges called him. He who wanders. He who wanders, listen, I will kill you. Borges. The Borges. I idolized him when I was in college. Many did, but I was different. It was 1961. I was an average lazy learner at the Universidad Laboral de Córdoba, floating around from one semester to another with barely passable grades. I had very few friends and almost no interests. One can say that I had an early form of an identity crisis. Besides chugging anisado, my only other passion was literature, Latin American literature. Borges and Neruda were at the forefront. One could only imagine my excitement when I saw a pamphlet hanging on the wall of the literature faculty. Spaces were limited, but who cared? It was the man himself, Jorge Luis Borges, coming to give us a lecture followed by an open panel of questions. Like a maniac, I rushed to the auditorium hours before the lecture. I was the first in line, and when the doors opened, I got the front row seat. The auditorium was packed with drooling children of young, self-proclaimed prodigies, awaiting the arrival of the Great One. And there he was, the blind lord of literature, walking upright onto the stage with a cane and his loyal assistant right by his side. Standing ovation. He nodded and made a "thank you, please be seated" gesture. Then he began. The lecture was dedicated to Spanish writers. I cannot distinctly recall if it was Cervantes or de Vega. It truly made no difference. Somehow, I managed to sit through his entire lecture, which lasted over 3 hours, and remember nothing. He talked slowly and methodically, pouring honey into our ears like Segovia's guitar, with his absent eyesight affixed on the ceiling. And then it happened. Something that caught me completely off guard. Before closing the day, Borges was about to take questions from the audience. Of course, I raised my hand, and so did about 100 other students. One of Borges's assistants whispered something into his ear, which made him smile. "It is an honor for me to be in front of an audience of young people, but our time is not infinite," he said with blind eyes still pinned on the far corner of the hall. "For that reason, I will randomly pick questions from 5 of you. I have never won any prizes or lotteries in my life. When I played poker or blackjack, I lost far more than I won. I knew my limitations, and that turned me into an average, apathetic person, rarely trying to outdo oneself. And so, sitting still, with little ambition, I got used to that, until that moment. When I saw Borges pointing his finger in my direction, that came as nothing short of a shock. Me? Yes, young man. Senor Borges picked you. Step forward and introduce yourself, said his assistant. I did not know what to ask, so I quietly mumbled my full name, Fernandez Agustin Navarro. Borges shifted his gray-shaded pupils in my direction as if reacting to a sudden buzzing of a fruit fly. Fernandez Agustin Navajo. Navajo. Haven't I met you once before, young man? He asked. No, Senor Borges, I never had the honor. But you will. We will meet again, Senor Navarro. You and I will meet again. But for right now, what is your question? The rest of the day was foggy. I don't even remember what question I asked. It must have been about him winning the pre-international, not sure. And maybe not important. No, not important at all. The greatest writer in the history of mankind called me by name. And then he said that bizarre, unreal thing he said about us meeting again. When? 9 years later. In 170. And there I was, a somewhat promising journalist, in one of London's somewhat scandalous tabloid newspapers. Every week, my name was featured on the second page alongside celebrity chronicles and vile rumors. My paycheck was decent enough for a small studio flat by Manchester Square. After years of having been put up by directionless studies, you could say I became something more than average, or at least that is what I believed. That day, it was early October, arguably the best season in London, began as usual. I ate my chic breakfast consisting of 2 scrambled eggs, ham, toast, and dark roast coffee at Barrymore's Diner, and was ready for a pleasant walk to the office. It was shortly after 8 a.m. and I was in no hurry. My route was the same as it was every day. Past the square, right turn on George Street, left turn on Thayer, another right on Marylebone. My thoughts that morning were all preoccupied with the piece I was working on, so I was slowly making my way through the square when something caught my eye. Or rather, someone. At first, I did not pay much attention to him, no more than I did to anybody else who idled at the square that morning. Hippie rascals with soiled hair playing guitar on every corner was a common theme in those days, and London town was certainly no exception. So here was another one of those misunderstood love proclaimers, sitting right behind the gated area of the square. Striped, worn-out jacket, heavy cap, sandals with clots of woolen socks sticking out. A common hippie bum, as anyone may have thought. I thought so too. Except this one had something that made my intestines churn. I didn't know what it was, but once I saw him, I felt the irresistible urge to instantly walk away and never see him again. The way he looked at me, that gloomy frown that made me think of a line from Oscar Wilde. That fellow's got to swing. There certainly was something otherworldly about that fellow. His eyes, as if carved from a rock below his forehead, were mercilessly drilling. Thousands of tiny holes through me. I added pace. As I turned back one last time, I noticed him slowly walking towards me. Past the gates of the square, onto the street, paying no attention to screeching tires of honking cars, walking right towards me. He's just a bum. No, he is not. Just another one of those unwashed hippies. No, run, run, run. George Street was empty like in post-war bombed quarters. I could hear my brisk footsteps. Or was it the drumming of my aorta against the chest he was catching up? Run? Don't be silly. Yes, run. First slowly, as if you're trying to not show your chaser that you're scared. No, not scared. More like in a hurry. Why am I running? I can take him out with one punch, but it really wasn't about that. It was my first experience of that feeling, which I can only describe as some sort of primordial sense of fear, panic, dread, unexplained sense of looming doom arching above you like a dark figure with a scythe. I ran. I ran faster than my feet could move. As I turned the corner on Thayer, I paused and looked back, fearing to see him right behind. Scrambled eggs, toast, and dark roast coffee were about to make their way back up through my esophagus. Wiping the sweat off my palms onto my pants, I bent forward in a protective position and looked around. Empty windows of George Street were checking me out like a toddler witnessing a parent in a cowardly act. Whoever that man was that incensed me into this uncontrollable panic, he was now gone. Shame on you, Fernandez Augustin, I repeated to myself while making futile attempts to enthrall palpitation to subside. Shame on you, I mumbled, repeating that word. Mumbling turned into whistling that song by Magic Lanterns. Shame, shame, I whistled, acting calm and self-composed. I sang without knowing words, only to convert my mind to something else. I sang so others wouldn't notice me shaking. I climbed the stairs of my office building, 3 at a time, 3rd floor. The familiar smell of the oils calmed me down. Safe haven. Shame on you, Fernandez Agustin Navarro. Even now I question myself, whether my journey to madness began on that day, or was it underway for many years? Madness that creeps in and recedes in tidal waves. Is that how it usually happens? All I know is that an hour later I was laughing at my little moment of weakness. Preposterous and rubbish, my thick Andalusian twang spoke to me. The idea of being fully checked out by a specialist did cross my mind, and I immediately thought of Dr. Patel in Camden Town. He'd give me a comfortable medical diagnosis like a panic attack and prescribe some white pills, I thought. Little did I know that the day had more surprises in store. The unnerving script development continued in a more eerie fashion when my boss marched to my desk with a pack of printed paper. No, Navarro, you are not going to see Dr. Patel in Camden Town, who will make a judgment call on your insanity. Instead, you are going to do an article on Jorge Luis Borges' new book. He is making his presentation today at the London Public Library and blah, blah, blah. I forgot about the panic attack. The thrill of seeing Master Borges again, 9 years later, was surreal. Moments later, I was sitting in a cab on my way to the London Public Library, scribbling all possible questions I should be asking him. El Informe de Brody? Other books? Forget it. I knew very well what I would ask. I paid the cab and galloped up the marble stairs leading to the hallway, where the master was about to hold his new book presentation. I elbowed myself through the crowd of journalists to occupy the coveted front row spot. Quick inventory check, wallet, J-sack, along with the omnipresent Swiss knife. Seconds ticked leisurely on my wristwatch. 4 more minutes. Forget this morning's sickness. Forget Dr. Patel. Collect yourself, Fernandez Augustin. Navarro. That's your last name, isn't it? Yes, Senor Borges, but how do you... 9 years ago in Cordoba. I told you we would meet again, do you remember? I nodded rapidly, completely forgetting he couldn't see me. Stupid. Perhaps, continued Borges, it would be more prudent for us to speak privately after the conference. I invite you to have coffee with me. You like Colombian coffee, Mr. Navarro? I shall see you precisely at 6 o'clock at the address that my assistant will provide. His blind eyes were still affixed at the top far corner of the hallway, far above all the congested, sharp-penciled critics and arduous followers of his divine writing. The attention was now all on me, as revealed by hundreds of photo flashes from behind. I thought of all the explaining that I would have to do tomorrow. How does Borges know you? Are you friends? You were raised in Cordova? Are you his illegitimate son? Back then, I did not know. Answers came later. Memory is a tricky animal. As I gaze over the valley and satiate my lungs with familiar smells, I cannot think of anything specific. Vague and elusive memories of my childhood home. And these orchards, these white chapels, and the old town itself. Nothing but an incomprehensible sensation somewhere down there, below the chest cage. I close my eyes and let the sun twirl around with tinted specks of mosaic light. I am trying to focus without looking. Alas, nothing comes to mind. I've been robbed of my memory. I cast my eyes at the trail again. He is closing in. It's hard for him to walk upward, and yet I see that determination in his eyes, in his tight grip of that wobbly walking stick, in the way he periodically stops to catch his breath and eyeball the remaining distance. I am not going anywhere. 5, 10 more minutes? Come and take me, old man. If you can. I almost see his facial expression under the heavily pronounced frontal lobe. It's a grin. It's an expression that says, "We shall see." Once I read an interview in the Morning Times. In it, Borges was portrayed as extremely humble and minimalistic. His house was depicted as a perfectly organized space with easy access to everything. Books on the shelves, judging from the admiration of the columnist, there were lots of them, were organized by theme and by title. Dictionaries and encyclopedias were grouped together on the same rack, so he could find them easily. In another article, dated 1966, I read that when Borges travels, and those travels were quite extensive, he carries a whole rack of books along, some of which may not even be read. When I entered his hotel room, that very book rack was the first thing that caught my eye. I stood perplexed at the multitude of titles, most unknown to me, when I heard the door swing wide open, and there he was entering through the doorway with a leisurely swinging cane. "Ah, Señor Navarro, how kind of you to visit this old man." I took a step towards him and produced some gibberish like, "Pleasure is all but mine." He half smiled and pointed his hand to the chair. "I know you will quite enjoy the taste of Colombian dark roast." Borges sat down and leaned slightly backwards, without releasing his cane. "Do you know the biggest advantage of being blind?" he asked and answered immediately. "Blind don't need light, so my utility bills are way lower." He laughed, at his own joke only to be interrupted by his assistant carrying a tray of aromatic coffee, poured in 2 small porcelain cups. Amazing how the very idea of drinking coffee instantly changes your mood before you even take your first sip. As I was readying to go on a pre-scripted monologue of expressing my gratitude and honor, Borges jumped right into the action. "I will get right to it, Señor Navarro. About you being here and about me remembering you. I know you have many questions. I will attempt to answer some, but not all. When you leave this hotel, there will still be some questions that you will have to find answers to on your own." He gently picked up his cup of coffee and, with a hand somewhat shaking, took an artistic sip. Yes, I had questions. So many that my brain membranes were buzzing in bewilderment and disbelief. Here I was, sitting in the room with one of the greatest writers, who happened to mysteriously know my name and, "Have you by any chance read The Book of Imaginary Beings?" So asked Borges. "I have. Many times. I read it in Spanish when it just came out. Very recently I bought the English translation in some shabby bookstore off Oxford Circus. I read that book far too many times, but never in its entirety, mostly starting on a random page, just as Borges had intended it to be consumed by his readers. You see, Señor Navarro, that book was, and perhaps still is, a never-ending work in progress, as human imagination has no boundaries. I have included what I had researched over 10 years ago, and then recently expanded and republished with more figments of collective human imagination. But the book is merely a small subset. In a way, the book writes itself. In some form, it's a labyrinth, an endless one, a living one, where every corridor and every room is never the same. What I had always wanted is the book to reflect the labyrinth in our collective subconsciousness, the force that drives our minds to craft. For that reason, all the creatures in my book are strictly fictional, mythical. Am I not boring you? Not at all. I understand, Señor Borges. He nodded and wiped a coffee grind off his nose. That book, as its title implies, is all about imaginary beings, tales, legends, folklore. But one thing that no one knows is that I had originally intended this book to include one more being, a being that goes by its Latin name, quietus est. It appeared and disappeared across many cultures, sometimes centuries apart. Very little is known of it, but what I found was indeed astonishing. First, this being is physically no different than an ordinary human. You may say it is human in many ways. As I studied this entity, I became more and more agitated. I could not stop. Like a madman, I was trying to learn more and more, but very soon the excitement turned into another feeling. Fear. Fear of what, Senor Borges? Borges's eyesight shifted from the corner of the room straight on me, as if he could perfectly see me. Fear of what I had uncovered. That quietus est is not a myth at all. He attempted to take another sip, but his hands started shaking, so he had to put the cup down, spilling some of it on the saucer and around the table. Pardon me, young man. I am trying to maintain composure, but you have not tried the coffee, he said, wiping his mouth and forehead with a knitted handkerchief. I raised the small cup and took a sip, disregarding the aromatic fumes of Colombian beans drifting down my internal gorges. Pardon me, sir, but you are saying that the imaginary being called quietus est was not imaginary. Is that why you decided not to include him in your book of imaginary beings? Only in part. Fear came from the realization of what it would mean for mankind. To know about its existence, you see, it's no secret that we are all well aware of our eventual demise. We all die. But imagine what would happen if we all stared right into the face of death every single day of our lives and knew the time that was left for us in this world. Death. Not as a vague concept portrayed by middle-aged artists, not as a folklore tale of a grim reaper, but as a real living entity that stalks you and walks around showing you a ticking clock counting down minutes and seconds, getting closer to you with every second, trying to grab your hand. Running from death is worse than death itself. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. But I shall talk no more. Allow me to give you my scribbles from years ago. These are unedited in their raw format, so please pardon the poor language. It's right there in the drawer. You will find a folder with a yellow piece of paper. Read it aloud while my ripe old body attempts to catch a breath. I opened the drawer as he instructed, and found a yellow piece of cursive handwriting, carved in Spanish with some Latin phrases. The scribbles were short, less than a page long with marks and scratches, but most of this was very much decipherable. He must have written this himself half-blind, I thought. What caused him to do that, and not dictate to his assistant? I unfolded the paper and began reading. It is said that one shall not know about its own ways in times of demise. The imminent. Passing is only felt by those that are either terminally ill, and even so, they don't possess the knowledge of when and where, or by death row inmates awaiting the exact day and time of their execution. Lack of such knowledge coerces us to exist. Sumerians believed in a certain deity. The word deity was scratched and replaced with demon of death, embodied in human flesh and bones, which again was scratched and replaced with entity, whose sole role was to stalk its victims and inform them of how much time they had left to live. Per the ancient Book of Dead, which was discovered as a set of clay tablets typically buried in corpses, only those that are luminous can see the deity, again crossed out twice, replaced with demon, then with entity. The luminous ones are thought to be either people with high spiritual powers, or vice versa. The cursed ones condemned by priests. The reference briefly reappears in some Egyptian manuscripts, but in later writings it is replaced by Anubis, or in rare occurrences, by Horus. The writings again depict this unnamed being as an eternal human, who never sleeps but always wanders. What's strange is that neither the Sumerians nor the Egyptians ever gave the entity a discrete name. However, the latter rare findings during the Dark Ages refer to him as quietus est. The only depiction of quietus est was that of an ordinary human standing next to a sun clock, which was used to measure the time that the Chosen One had left to live. From time to time, quietus est stalks the Chosen One, and when cornered, moves hands of the clock forward to shorten the lifetime. If the chosen one cannot escape, then his time eventually runs out. The very last reference was found in Enough. Mr. Navarro, you understand the idea. Now on to the main question. Why are you here? He drew closer, and a dull shadow from a lamp cut right through his elongated forehead. Quietus est is an eternal wanderer who is always with us, the timekeeper who sits at the edge of the stage, with a ticking watch on his wrist. The greatest gift given to mankind is its inability to see him. When I lost my sight, I thought blindness was a blessing in disguise. But one does not require eyes to see the wanderer. What eyes cannot see, ears can hear, and skin can feel. I hear him, I feel him. You are here, Mr. Navarro, because you and I are the luminous ones. Borges paused and asked me with a trembling voice, Mr. Navarro, you saw him too, didn't you? Cold shivers that had been accumulating in my lower back rushed up my spinal cord in millions of explosions. Nausea formed a massive ball of air in my throat, and for a moment I struggled to breathe, desperately trying to cease the thumping. Inside, I pushed words out. I saw him today. How do you get used to the notion of being a passerby on this earth? Ordinary humans do not have to get used to that. We have that built-in protection layer, that safety cork in our brain membranes that separates the realization of being mortal from flooding down upon us. It allows us to breathe the air. It lets us exhibit this extraordinary yet sacred carelessness. The mental block that denies the laws of life on a primitive emotional level, even for the keenest scholars. The indecipherable tetragrammaton is shown to us in every step we take, in every cup of Colombian coffee we sip, and in every word of wisdom that we collect from books. Every second we bypass the sinister tick-tock and hear the name of the god being whispered into our ears. And yet we, humans, turn around and whistle, shame, shame, deceiving our own self-cognizance. And that, as Senor Borges called it, is the true blessing. Those who possess the name of the divine being are doomed. Knowledge is madness. Knowledge is inexistence. Knowledge of death is worse than death. We sat in his hotel room until early morning, the two luminous and doomed souls. Our casual exchange of words was amplified by the ticking of the clock. It was dawn when I noticed Borges nodding in his sleep. His left hand was still resting on the cane, and his pupils were shuffling behind shut eyelids. Borges was dreaming. So must have I. As I was exiting the foyer of the hotel, I hid behind the column and looked around the street. It was empty. Bleak light of street lamps drew strange crossbeams on pavements. Early October leaves were gyring in closed circles like witches around the fire. I was looking around, hoping to not see him. He wasn't there, but he was. I felt his presence not very far from me. Muscat orchards. They resonate inside like echoes of a guitar string heard from a deep alcove. But nothing particular comes to mind. I am trying to shift focus from one object to another, but my nomad memory is lost in endless labyrinths. You took my memories away from me, didn't you? Wait, mortal. Wait 5 more minutes and you will know the answer, I hear in my brain. He is talking to me now. I can see how the long uphill walk is wearing him out, but what are pain and tiredness when you're crossing the finish line? Borges warned me, do not ever come close to him. Do not look him straight in the eyes. He will always be near. His watch will be ticking. If he attempts to catch on, run, but he will forever follow. In a way, he will be like a shadow of you. And I ran. And he wandered. I evaded. He followed. He came too close to me in my hotel room on the second day after my long night in Borges's quarters. The fool in me still thought that escaping from him would be as easy as moving into a new flat, or checking into a hotel, so I did just that. It was some shabby hotel minutes from my work where I decided to spend a few nights just to think things through. That evening, and I remember every minute of it, was my first face-to-face encounter with him. My room, B6, was on the basement level. As I stumbled through the dark hotel corridor, trying to find the key to my room, I felt his presence, but my ignorant foolishness dismissed all mental warnings and turned the keys. As the door hinge squeaked, I took my first step into the hotel room. A street-level window was casting two thick yellow streaks of light on the floor carpet. I smelled dust and spider webs. He was in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed with a rope in his hand. A thin white blanket was covering his head like a shroud around a statue. I stood in a stupor like a paralyzed insect. An avalanche of sweat gushed from every pore of my body. With my hand twisted behind my back, I was feverishly trying to twist the doorknob. He got up from the bed with a groan. He took a step towards me, hand too sweaty to turn the knob. "Open it! Open!" He grabbed my wrist. "Open! Run!" The stretched corridor of the hotel basement flashed like random shots of a silent movie. "Run! B5, B2, B1, run! Staircase, up, exit, run! Your time is coming, Fernandez Agustin Navarro." A whisper crawled into my ears. "Coming, coming," hissed the wind. I ran until my legs gave in. I fell down somewhere in the outskirts of the town, passing out in an alley amidst rubbish until sunup. My madness has begun. In the days following my first face-to-face encounter with Quietus Est, I'd moved out of my London flat. I had some savings, enough to tramp town to town, continent to continent, doing temp jobs here and there, sometimes sleeping on streets. He was right behind me. Even if I didn't see him for a month, I knew he would soon catch on. It would be only a matter of time for him to pop up somewhere, on the opposite side of the street, in the next car over on the subway, or madly prying through shutters of windows in the house across. My attempts to speak to Borges were futile. How does the blind master live with this curse, I wondered? How does he manage to evade his sinister follower? I had questions, far more than I had anticipated. But Senor Borges was already on the other side of the globe. I wrote him letters, he never replied. I tried calling hotels where he stayed. Unavailable. The books that he wrote, I bought all of them in attempts to find hidden meanings. What if he had secret messages for me inside? His writings? The Book of Sand, Dr. Brody's report. I even searched his earlier writings, analyzing every word. Pointless, futile, until 1983. Shakespeare's Memory, his final book, as it turned out to be. I was somewhere in Eastern Europe when I bought the book. Immediately I began my scrupulous study, letter by letter, page by page, analyzing every space and every punctuation sign. And that's when I found it. The answer. The answer was the story itself. The story that did not require much study or decryption. All I had to do was read it. I knew I had to come face to face with Quietus Est like Borges did, but not before having to go through the life of an exile. That's what Borges had intended me to do. Such was his final and only message to me, embodied within his last story. A story written for the public, but intended for my eyes only. The story was that the protagonist receives memories of Shakespeare, memories that overwhelm him, overpowering his own. He forgets modern-day cars and engines, instead remembering faces and names from some distant past. Memories he has never known. Memories that belong to another man. In a way, he will be like a shadow of you. Borges told me that night. Slowly but surely, my shadow was becoming me. That's why I can only vaguely remember you, my childhood home. Him or me, no more running. It ends here. A few more minutes, I say to myself as I look at the watch. There he is. He is out of breath. Beaten, tired, and bent by the weight of his own arid body. One last push, old man, and we will meet. I am hiding behind the rock. His footsteps on gravel and sand. I can tell them from any other footsteps in the world. His breathing, wheezing, and crackling. I am counting to 5. He knows where I am, but he is too tired to take that last step. Let me take that step for you. I am staring at his face, wrinkled like leaves of an ancient scroll. Time's up, Quietus Est, I am telling him. He is not fighting back, and my Swiss blade finds a comfy spot below his Adam's apple. I am going to finish him now. Popping sounds are coming out from his flabby throat. What are you trying to tell me, old man? Let me hear your last words. I am easing the pressure to let him talk, but the sounds that come out are not words but laughter. You are confused, he says. You've got it all wrong. Let me help you understand. I am letting him sit up. He is coughing blood. One wrong move and he's dead. He wipes the blood off his lips and nods in understanding. All my life I have followed you, he begins slowly. It's a miracle I have come this far and lived this long. Ever since I left Cordoba, I was a ticking time bomb. I was diagnosed as suicidal. Doctor after doctor, therapies, specialists, prescriptions, yoga. I have tried them all. She helped for a while and the disease subsided. But then it rolled back with a new, stronger wave. It's this disease that nests here. And, he points to his head, forcing me to look for a way to end my own life. It all began in London, on that morning when I was sitting on the bench in the middle of that square, feeling the disease gnawing on my brain. My first attempt was in that hotel, room B6. I sat on the bed in that dark room for hours with a rope in my hand and a blanket over my head. Death opened the door and stood above me in the darkness of the room. Oh, how I wanted my pain to end. But it was not meant to be. Not then, not there. I had to live on. Ever since that day, it has been a cat-and-mouse game between us. I chased. Death, and death would always slip away. Until now. He pauses, rubbing his flabby neck, then points his finger down the valley and continues. I was born in that house. I remember every moment of my childhood. My parents, my toys, my school. I remember playing hide-and-seek with my cousins in Muscat Gardens and dozing off to Sunday clergy in that white chapel. I remember Eastern rugs being washed on the street, and the smell of grapes. My name is Fernandez August Navarro, and you have no true name, but they call you Quietus Est, the one who wanders. Filaments of scorching infernos have been ignited all over me. The fire sets off inside my eyelids, spreading over to all facial pores and trickling down my body. Lies, imbecile lies, I roar. Look at me, he says. I am an old man, and you, still young and strong as you will always be. You have not aged. Now think more. What do you remember of your childhood? Shakespearean memories of random sounds and smells are all you have gained from me. Master Borges knew who you were. He cracked you and then he tricked you. He made you think you were me. That was his way of evading you by not revealing you the truth to you until his final breath, final book, or final story. You are the one who wanders, and those memories you have, those are my memories. And now that I have told you who you really are, you must finally finish me. I have heard enough of his fibs. I am throwing my knife away. I shall not require any blades to finish him. With hands clenched around his thin neck, I am strangling him. I hear him squeal as the grip tightens. I feel the crackling of neck bones between my thumbs. I see him gulping the air in warm convulsions. He looks peaceful. I sit on his chest and watch his last breath picked up by the wind, carried down the valley to the gardens, passing by the white chapel and the house where he grew up. The scorching wind of Andalusia is pouring sunlight onto his face, toying with eyelashes, pounding on cheeks, and gyring through hair. He must have missed the smell of the valley and the ripening softness of muscat fluff glistening in the air. I am rewinding my wristwatch and walking downhill along the wavy trail, my thumbs still sore from killing. I am taking small steps sideways. Once I reach El Jardinito Road, I will hop on the first bus, and from there I will travel west. Or north. Destination will never matter. Anywhere is where the roads take me. Me, the one who wanders. Let's start story 2. I was 18 at the time. I'd just graduated high school. And what was probably a really exciting and memorable time for most people was a stressful race against time for me. You see, my dad was very traditional. If I were going to be living in his house after high school, even just over the summer between graduation and college, I needed a job. If not, I was freeloading. And he swore with an adamance I certainly didn't care to test that I'd be out. On the street if I was unemployed for long. I'd had months of preparation. Hell, years, really. This entire time I could have been looking. He certainly hadn't waited until now to clue me in on the terms of living with him after high school. But I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. Finding a job back then wasn't easy. I'd dyed my hair green, and my nose and lips were pierced, not to mention the gauges and the shitty stick and poke snake on my forearm that my 16-year-old self had afflicted upon me. Case in point, I wasn't getting hired most places, and being that I had about a week at the time left to figure it all out, like usual, I was in a mad scramble to line something up before facing the consequences. But then, as if some morbid miracle, a cop got shot and killed on 84th Avenue pretty close to the pass and go out there, and an opening for the night shift position appeared not long after. The pass and go and 84th Avenue as a whole had a pretty bad reputation. See, 84th was one of the only roads in town still unpaved in parts, namely the north end shortly after the pass and go, and it wound along a pretty deep drainage ditch where no guardrails had ever been built, even after decades of complaints. There was a particularly tight bend up the road where a lot of drunk drivers and speeding teens learned that they were not in fact invincible, some of them even taking that lesson to the grave with them, and the lack of streetlights just made it all the more dangerous. But those were just the logical concerns. In a tiny town like mine, people are bored enough to run with sensational bullshit, and so 84th could never just be a dangerous road with poor construction and lack of safety. Measures to blame, but was instead cursed and haunted. People died there so often not because it was just a hazardous roadway, but because it was bloodthirsty and evil. People's reception went out on the road not because it was essentially the furthest you could be from town, but because some malicious entity wanted you isolated. You get it. The woods beyond the ditch were even worse. On 3 occasions since the turn of the century, bodies were found out there. 1 a suicide and 2 in shallow graves. And in a town as small as mine had been, that's a pretty sizable number. For a criminal, though, it only made sense to bury them there. Again, this place was basically abandoned and totally secluded. Really, the only other people that far northwest of town were the wagies at the pass and go, and they weren't getting paid enough to be on the lookout for anything. Not to mention, they had their own weirdness to deal with. All sorts of strange and illegal activities happened in that pothole-ridden parking lot, and why wouldn't it? That place was the last beacon of humanity's presence in the town for miles, until you got to 90th Street, the main road shooting off from the highway. So anybody working there had enough going on at their own doorstep and wouldn't be paying any attention to cars pulled off on the side of the road with mysteriously heavy duffel bags in the trunk. Suffice it to say, once the position opened, I was the only person in town out of options enough to drop off an application. And wouldn't you know it, I was scheduled to start 2 days later. I picked it up quickly. The job was easy, and though at first I was shadowing a guy that by all accounts could have been undead, I was left to my own devices a week later. To be honest, I actually kind of liked the job at first. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. were pretty standard. Hours of consciousness for me anyway, and working the graveyard shift finally gave me an excuse to sleep in until 3. It was dead most nights. Sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, I literally didn't see a single customer. And other nights, the goofiness of my interactions with various druggies kept things interesting. But those kinds of nights aren't what this story is about. The first time I remember being pretty confused was only 2 weeks after I'd started the job. I was pretty stoned at the time, so I tensed up when I saw a cop walking toward the door. But I wasn't complacent enough to blaze it before work, without eye drops for fear of these exact situations. Not so much worried about getting arrested, but about what my dad would do to me. I also had a little bit of a heads up in the form of a faulty open sign in the window. The neon would pretty often flicker or dim for some reason when people were coming up to the door. Really couldn't tell you why it happened, but when I was totally fucking off behind the counter, it was my cue to act natural for a minute. And since a bunch of random bullshit was stacked up on the side of the counter to my left, facing the parking lot and the pumps, I couldn't ever see out the windows unless I was actively looking over it. So needless to say, whatever was wrong with that sign certainly wasn't something I was going to try and get fixed. When the cop walked in, sort of leaned back as casually as possible and tried to make small talk with him so his mind wouldn't wander anywhere else. "See any crazies?" I inquired. "Not yet," he answered, perusing the energy drinks like a selection of fine wines. He sounded pretty bored, and I hoped that that wasn't an indication that he was looking for something to do. Well, lucky you. I chuckled. Can't say the same myself. Yeah. He settled on a sugar-free monster. He walked over to the counter, and I remember thinking he was either a new guy or one of those officers that just never stopped being motivated, showing off his short hair and fresh fade. Though judging off how young he looked, definitely early 20s, I was going with the former. These were the worst types of cops from my experience. They're always looking for a way to stand out to their higher-ups. Yeah, I continued. Saw a lady sleeping in a shopping cart out back. Asked her why the shopping cart, and she said she learned from a TV show that you should never sleep on the bare ground. You learn something new every day, I smirked. That actually happened last week, but who's counting? Pfft, he actually smiled slightly. Weirdos, man. Yeah. Will that be all? Yeah. $3.29. He tapped his card on the reader, and while the sale processed, I remember actually feeling slightly concerned for the guy. I wasn't a big fan of cops, but one of them had died around here recently after all, and just talking with this guy face to face sort of humanized him to me. As he cupped the top of the drink and slid it off the counter, I said, "Stay safe, out there." He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "Nah, just, that cop that got shot out here a couple weeks ago." "Huh?" I just stared at him. "Listen," he peered at my name tag for a second. "Carter, you can't believe everything you hear about this place. 84th Avenue. It's just a street, man. Most of what you hear about this place is embellished or even totally made up." Yeah, all right. Well, have a good night, officer." I paused, squinting at his name tag back. "Brady." He walked off into the night, his energy drink in his hand. At the time, I didn't give that interaction a whole lot of thought. I learned most of my news from memes, and it was definitely possible I'd been wrong. Unlikely, but possible. But over time, stranger things began to occur. And I'm not talking about druggies sleeping in shopping carts. Began to pick up on an anomaly with the neon sign. See, it actually didn't flicker very often. It seemed to be at first, but after getting caught off guard multiple times by random people coming in, I realized I couldn't trust it as much as I thought I could. Yet strangely, though it seemed inconsistent, I realized it always blinked and dimmed for certain people. There was this lady that would come in about once a week and buy a scratch-off ticket. I figured she had to be pretty depressed, because she was always wearing the same clothes and was coming to this dingy-ass place with relative frequency. Every time she'd ask for the same ticket, cash Kaiser, and every time I'd slide it to her, she'd smile at me and say, "Maybe tonight's the night." Even in her voice, I could hear how much she needed a break. But I guess tonight was never the night, because a week or two later, she'd always be back, always dressed the same, always buying a colorful strip of false hope that things would suddenly change for her. I tried to chat with her the more she came in, but she wasn't keen on giving away details about her life. She was mostly unresponsive, just nodding or giving me one-word answers, and then she'd head out in kind of a hurry. But her clothes weren't the only thing that stayed the same every time. Every single time she came into the pass and go, that sign would flicker. Now, I could have just been reading into things too much. I wondered if the sign was ultimately connected to a wire through the ground, maybe. And maybe certain people were, stepping over it, and those people just kind of came in the same way every time. I didn't really know. I'm not an electrician. But the sort of Groundhog Day that transpired every time she stopped by really did intrigue me. Then, one night, in early July, I had another curious experience. I was listening to some podcast about ayahuasca and contemplating if I'd ever take the plunge when the green flicker of my inconsistent early warning system caught my attention. And when my eyes trailed from the neon sign and over the merchandise, on the counter to the pumps out in the dark beyond, I saw a guy pumping gas into his truck, probably in his mid-30s. He had this really gruff look on his face, but I wouldn't have paid it much mind except for the fact someone was with him, a girl about my age. While he was by the pump, she was heading into the store. She had black hair down to about her shoulders, and these big brown eyes. Her skin was kind of pale, like she probably didn't get out much, and she wore skinny jeans and a gray top. As soon as I noticed her approaching, I stepped back from the window. I definitely didn't want to creep her out by being seen peeking over the counter through the glass. She came in, and as the chime above the door rang, I couldn't help but glance at her as she beelined to the snacks. She was cute, and I was considering flirting with her at first, but then I glanced over the counter again at the guy in the parking lot, presuming him to be her big brother or dad or something. I didn't want to piss him off, so I decided to keep it casual. She was over by the coolers on the back wall the next time I found her, not looking my direction while she scanned our selection of sports drinks. Then she grabbed a red Gatorade and came walking up to the front. She put the drink in a bag of classic Lays on the counter, and when I noticed it was almost 4 in the morning, I couldn't help but inquire, "What's got you out so late?" I was scanning the items with muscle memory, my eyes meeting hers after she glanced at the counter for a second as if considering a response. "Nothing really, big bro." I flicked my eyes to the guy in the parking lot, and at this, her nose wrinkled. "Ew." No, I thought that was a strange response. "Ew," I asked as the total popped up on the screen. "It's gross to have a brother?" "It's gross to kiss your brother," she smiled flatly. And I didn't want to seem creepy, but I couldn't help but get on the tip of my toes for a second and peek at him again. No doubt the guy was in his 30s, and if I had to be more specific, I'd be leaning more toward late 30s than early. He was wearing boots, jeans, and a blue and brown flannel, and had a 5 o'clock shadow I could see from the store. The more I looked at him, the more weirded out I felt. Then again, none of this was my business, and I didn't want to pry. She definitely didn't seem to be with him against her will. "Ah, gotcha," I smiled. But the whole thing felt unignorably off to me as she handed me a 10. "You guys going on a road trip or something?" Something like that. There was this turbulent mix of emotions in her eyes, and while she looked excited, definitely thrilled about something, she also kind of seemed to be longing too. I only got a glimpse of it though, as she unexpectedly asked, "You ever just do something totally crazy? Like overnight?" I mean, I took a heroic dose of shrooms once on a whim without a trip sitter. I smirked, and she chuckled too, but shook her head. "I didn't mean something like that." She paused. "Anyway, have a good rest of your night." "You, too," I remarked, but as she turned and walked away, I felt a steadily increasing urge to say something. To ask her why she was with this guy that looked like he could be her dad. To inquire more about this crazy overnight thing she was hinting at, or this road trip-esque adventure she was on that had her at this infamous gas station at 4 in the morning. But I was just too immature at the time and selfish. Even feeling like I should probably investigate what was happening, probably pay more attention to what was going on, I also felt like I really couldn't be bothered. I told myself that it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't be nosy, but really, I just didn't want to get involved. Though, a moment after she left the store, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I peered over the cigarettes at the truck in the parking lot. She was already inside, and at first it looked pretty unassuming. It was old and kind of a faded red, with 2x4s in the back under a blue tarp. All in all, nothing suspicious. But when he got to the turnoff onto 84th and he took a right, I noticed the passenger side window was broken, like it had been punched out. I couldn't see the girl well this far away, but her being in this older guy's truck with the right window shattered made me feel even stranger about the whole ordeal. Something was definitely off. But at the time, my lazy ass just didn't care enough. It was mid-July, though, when the veneer of eccentric late-night patrons was shattered forever, and I was forced to see what was really going on. It began with a loud rumbling from the parking lot. I got immediately uncomfortable as some biker douche rolled up, revving his engine like, if it were loud enough, I'd give him a discount. Then he climbed off the bike and came stumbling toward the door, the green neon flickering onto him from the window. I could tell just from the counter that he was totally hammered. He could barely even make it inside. Came right to the counter and absolutely reeked of alcohol. "Give me a pack of menthols, Camel," he slurred, leaning onto the counter with his right hand. "You okay, man?" I grabbed it. "What the fuck do you mean?" His hostility freaked me out just as much as it annoyed me. "You're obviously drunk off your ass," I replied. "You just drove here on a motorcycle. Seems like a bad idea. Shut the fuck up and sell me the cigarettes, man." He was glaring at me like he was ready to swing, and though he was so fucked up, I don't doubt I could have taken him. He was still a big guy, and it really wasn't worth the trouble. "Your funeral," I muttered, grabbing the cigarettes and noting it was the last pack. Normally, I would have made some quip about that, but with this guy, I just wanted him to leave. When I slid him the cigarettes, he flung his cash at me and almost walked away without his change. Then he stumbled off back out the door, shoving it open so hard I wondered if he broke it. And then, without any warning, as he stumbled along the window toward his bike, his entire body changed. My breathing stifled as I noticed his head was dented in, multiple of his teeth were missing, and blood ran down his face and soaked his jacket. He was covered from head to toe in cuts and scrapes, and his right arm was broken, the bone jutting out slightly. I stumbled back and tripped, knocking over the vape pens, then almost slipped on them as I scrambled to my feet and chased him out the door, staring in horrified bewilderment as he climbed onto a waterlogged motorcycle, the front of it totally wrecked. "Hey," I screamed. "Man, are you all right?" He just looked at me, and as he stared into my eyes, his look was totally different than before. He wasn't angry or confrontational or even drunk. He just had this totally sober look of regret. He stared at me a moment longer, then he revved his engine, and somehow he and his obliterated bike sped off into the night, leaving me totally alone in the flickering neon. And then, as soon as he disappeared up the road, the sign stopped blinking, steadily shining like usual. I sprinted over to the doors, yanking them open and almost collapsing as I barreled into the back room and landed in the seat at the computer. I pulled up the security camera footage and rewound it a couple of minutes, desperate to see if somehow, in some inconceivable way, I'd just been seeing things. But though I was willing to believe he wasn't actually injured and it was somehow all in my head, I wasn't at all prepared for the sight of me just talking to the empty air. That's right, the guy never even came in at all. I rewatched my harsh reaction to the absent revving of his engine, my eyes following nothing walking along the window, to the door that never opened. Then I realized that I'd never actually grabbed the pack of menthols. My hand stopped over it and handed nothing to no one. It was the same thing for the cash register. And then at last, I watched myself stumble, back and fall, flinging shit everywhere in a panic. I ran out the door, screaming into the night, but only I was there. It filled me with a terror so paralyzing, I almost just left right then and there. I sat there at the desk for a moment, shaking. Was I hallucinating? I'd heard you can get permanent, schizophrenia-like psychosis from psilocybin, but this was the first and only time I'd ever hallucinated when not on the shit, and as I just stared at the monitor unblinkingly, shaking in place, I really couldn't tell what was more horrific, if I hadn't really seen that, or if I had. But then my eyes gravitated to the one part of my memory that was corroborated by the cameras, the neon. It was dim, and as I unpaused the video, I watched it continue to flicker, all the way until my eyes turned to the end of 84th that I could see. And as soon as they did, it shined like normal again. I rewound the footage again, and sure enough, as soon as I began to react to the phantom motorcycle, the sign started flickering. It flickered the whole time, throughout that whole interaction until the biker was gone. So I wasn't crazy. Something suggested there was more going on than me just losing my shit. But then, what the hell had just happened? I didn't even go back to the front as I began racking my mind for all the other times the sign had flickered, and instantly, I recalled the scratch-off lady. I quickly Googled 84th Avenue deaths, thinking that maybe I could identify some of these people, but the first thing that came up was the police officer shooting. Then my jaw dropped as I stared into the memorialized eyes of Officer Brady. I could barely sit still as his eyes looked back at me from the computer screen. The same officer I had spoken to just a month ago who didn't know about any officer shootings in the area, because he was the officer that would be shot. I kept looking, and before long I found the scratch-off lady. She was some lonely, divorced woman who committed suicide in the woods a couple miles north of here in 2011. And the biker had crashed into the ditch right off the bend 3 years ago, one of many drunk drivers that didn't react to the turn in time and went face first into the canal. I screamed as the chime above the door sounded, and I heard someone spin around at the front of the store, startled by my reaction. I scrambled to my feet and walked up front, freezing as my eyes met those of Officer Brady's, glinting in the flickering neon. "You good?" He seemed to be both concerned and frustrated. I just stared at him, totally unable to speak. "Yeah. You, on something?" He peered. "No." He looked at me a little longer, but then he walked his immortalized path through the gas station, his gaze drifting over the cooler of energy drinks. I couldn't help but stare right at him, utterly wordless, as he moved in almost the exact same way as he had back in June, at last grabbing that same sugar-free monster. Then he walked to the counter, and my hands were shaking as I took the drink from him. "Hey," he looked at me. "You all right?" I stared into the eyes of the dead man. "Personal stuff. Is something going on?" "Looked like you were looking at the security camera footage when I came in," he noted, and I listened in silence. If someone's prowling around here, I could investigate. I wanted to address what was really happening, to pick his mind and see if he was really unaware that he was dead, or if he was just haunting this place and all of this was an act. Then I began to wonder if maybe this was some kind of time machine, if I could warn him about what was bound to happen to him and prevent him from dying in the first place. But as I recalled the biker's corpse mounting his waterlogged Harley, I came to the conclusion that nothing I said to this visage of the officer was going to save his life. And I further wagered, as soon as he walked out that door, he'd be corpse too. "You there?" He waved his hand in front of my face. "Talk to me, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. "Yeah, I'm fine." I slid him his drink. "You gonna tell me the total?" "It's free. Tonight on me. Have a good one, Officer Brady." He blinked. He stood there for a moment as if considering investigating the gas station regardless of my cooperation, trying to get to the bottom of my unusual behavior. And maybe in life, he would have. But his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. I walked back inside and had made my mind up to quit then and there. I wrote up a note and left it in the manager's office. Then I locked the place up and left the key under the propane cylinder exchange out front, about to text my morning relief where the key was when I froze. I remembered the girl with black hair and big brown eyes, the neon sign that I had once thought of as my early warning customer alert, and now understood to be some kind of paranormal detection radar, had flickered with her entrance too, just like it had for the biker and the scratch-off lady and Officer Brady. In that moment, I became weirdly consumed with this desire to know what had happened to her. Maybe it was because I found her cute, or maybe it was because even in the moment that night something felt horribly off. But for some reason or another, I became totally invested in figuring out what had happened to her, to the point that I decided to unlock the store and stick around. I went back to the computer, but for some reason, though I was able to find information about other people that had died in the area, some of whom I'd even seen walk into this gas station's very doors in the middle of the night, I was completely unable to find her. And it really ate at me. I went back to the front at some point around 5 a.m., but still, I was just searching on my phone for the girl, though by the time my relief came in at 6 a.m., I still hadn't found shit. And that was my obsession. For the next couple of days, when I'd exhausted every article about deaths on 84th, I began to wonder if anyone even knew she was dead. So I searched for local missing persons, and I looked into all of them. But still, none of them were this girl. It haunted me for days. I began reliving as much of that night as I could, trying to recall every single detail. I could remember her, hinting that the guy she was with was her boyfriend, which even then was a red flag. But now, as I remembered that older guy in the parking lot pumping gas in the dark, it filled me with dread. I didn't get that good of a look at him. I could tell he had some stubble and was wearing a flannel jeans and boots, but what good was that? As for his truck, I wasn't sure exactly what make or model it was, just that it was red and looked old. I could only assume the punched out glass was like the biker's motorcycle, something that had taken place after the girl's death, or more likely during. Then I remembered her asking me if I had ever done something crazy and overnight. And as I mulled over the words for hours, sitting on the back porch smoking a bowl as the sun set before my shift, I ruminated on all the possibilities such a vague statement could mean. But then, when I remembered her saying she was on something, like a road trip, it started to click. The guy she was with, her boyfriend, must have been taking her off somewhere, probably far from her home. Maybe they'd been talking online, probably in secret, because no parent would let their kid date a grown-ass man like that. And she seemed to be about 18 like myself. Maybe he'd driven to where she lived. And this big, crazy, overnight decision she made was climbing into this stranger's vehicle that she'd been tricked into thinking was safe, driving with him for God knows how long as he took her to God knows where. And then they stopped at the Pass and Go on 84th Avenue for gas. At first, that part didn't make sense to me. Yeah, this place was a couple miles south of 90th Street, which came right off the highway. But why wouldn't he stop for gas at one of the many gas stations out there closer to the interstate? Though, the more I thought about it, the more I started to piece it together. If this guy really was from out of state and was trying to get her back to his place undetected, it made sense he didn't pull right off the highway to the nearest gas station where cops could be combing through camera footage. Instead, he drove off to the most secluded road in the whole town, 84th Avenue. I started to feel overwhelmed. I had nothing to go off of to narrow my search, really. And for all I knew, I'd have to look at missing persons listings for people in every surrounding state, and maybe even farther than that. I mean, it was just impossible. But at last, saying a prayer to whoever was listening, I typed in the vaguest string of clues I had. Missing girl, brown eyes, black hair, red truck. And then I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. I searched at first in various counties in Iowa. Maybe she was just from a lower part of the state. But when that didn't yield anything, I searched the same sentence with counties in Missouri at the end. And then Kansas. And then Nebraska. And then, after over an hour of looking, my heart skipped a beat. I saw those big brown eyes looking back at me through my cell phone screen. I clicked on the news article, and there, in her missing persons listing, was unmistakably the girl's face, just like the one in the gas station. I immediately read the article, like it was some sort of divine revelation. Her name was Amber Wicker. She would have just turned 18. In fact, her birthday was only 2 months ago, but her disappearance was 4 months ago, which meant that on the night that she'd actually stepped into the gas station and not the memory I had cohabitated, she was only 17, making the whole thing even more disturbing to me. She was last seen on her front door's Ring camera, climbing into a red truck parked across the street, almost totally out of frame, but even in the glimpse of it available in the video, I could tell it was the same one when I saw the 2x4s and blue tarp. My stomach sank as I watched Amber hurry down the driveway, looking once over her shoulder to the safety of the house she was abandoning, then reaching the truck and climbing into the passenger seat before it took off up the road. Leaned back in the chair, letting out a beleaguered sigh. So Amber Wicker was her name, and as far as the police knew, she was missing. But I knew she was dead. After all, every customer that had walked in beneath the flickering sign had been a corpse, and as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I assumed her case wasn't any different. So as much as I wanted to stop working at that place, As much as it bothered me to see those ghosts walking the faded paths of their memories through the purgatory that was the pass and go off 84th Avenue, I had to stay. I had to wait until Amber came back so I could gather enough evidence to give to the police. After all, though some of the dead only came in once, like the biker, others had come in twice, like Officer Brady, and even others had come in on almost a weekly basis, like the scratch-off lady. Eventually, I hoped she would come back. And so, the rest of July, I picked up more night shifts, desperately wanting to be there the night she hopefully returned. I also chatted with Justin, the guy who I'd shadowed and who worked nights when I was off, but his brain seemed constantly fried on something, and if he'd had any paranormal experiences, he hadn't noticed. I asked him about the sign flickering, and he said it did that on occasion, so I knew he'd seen at least some ghosts, but when I asked him about Amber, he wasn't sure if he'd seen her or not. Needless to say, I wasn't getting anything useful out of him. I asked him to just keep his eyes open for her, and if he saw her, to note the license plate of the truck by the pump. You'd think such a strange request would raise an eyebrow, but he was so zombified on whatever the hell it was he was abusing in his off time that he just said, "Sure." In the weeks after I'd pinned down Amber's true identity, I began to research her a bit. I could only find 2 articles about her. One was the one I first found, which just had the basic details of her disappearance, and the other was an even smaller article in which her parents had given a statement and a number to call if anyone knew anything. I really wanted to call that number, but I knew that right now, I honestly didn't have shit. I could always say I was at the gas station that night and saw something, but the security camera footage only went back 60 days, so there'd be no proof one way or the other. I didn't have a license plate, and I was a whole state over. I didn't have a lot of faith the police would be able to do much with that, and I didn't want to give her parents false hope, so I decided I'd just wait until her memory replayed again, and I could piece together some actionable details. In the meantime, the more I searched her, the more I was at last able to find some of her socials. But her Instagram was private, and her Twitter was inactive for years. Though when I stumbled upon her Facebook, even though it too hadn't had a post uploaded in 2 years, I felt strangely more connected to her as I scrolled through her photos. This immortal anthology of a dead girl's time on Earth, floating in cyberspace for anyone to find and sharing her memories from before. Her life was prematurely snuffed out. I found pictures of her laughing with her friends, smiling at a dance and blowing out birthday candles. I saw random posts ranging from her excitedly proclaiming she'd gotten her learner's permit to complaining about failing some biology test. All these moments of this girl's life, both significant and insignificant, were here forever. Memories, accessible to anyone that cared to find them. And really, her appearance at the gas station wasn't much different. Though that memory was supernatural, unfolding in real time over a real place, it was, in essence, the same. Just some moment of her existence that unaffiliated people such as myself were able to witness. Though whether or not I had been the one to see it for a reason, or my witnessing of it was just as inconsequential and random as me scrolling through her Facebook page, I felt that I was a part of this girl's story now, and it was my duty to help her however I could. But by August, she still hadn't come back, and strangely, neither had Officer Brady or the biker or even the scratch-off lady. There was only one other occurrence of the sign flickering, and I guess it was either a no-show ghost or a fuck you from the universe, because no one ended up coming in. I got worried that whatever supernatural phenomenon had been taking place was over, just as suddenly as it had begun, and that I'd never see her again, never be given a chance to atone for my apathetic complacency that night when I could have paid more attention to a situation that was obviously suspicious, and even worse, I was shipping off to college in just a couple of weeks. My remaining days at the pass and go were numbered. So on August 3rd, while sitting behind the counter in the dead of night, waiting for the purgatorial replay of an apparition's final stop on the drive to her untimely death, I made up my mind. If she didn't come in tonight, then tomorrow. I'd take matters into my own hands. It dawned on me that Amber must have died nearby here, The only ghosts that ever walked into this gas station were those that had died on 84th Avenue. And that was true for Officer Brady, who had been shot just down the road, the biker who had crashed into the canal by the bend, the scratch-off lady, who had hanged herself in the woods, and all the others I'd seen walk through those doors beneath the flickering green glow. And though I had no idea where to look, I had one thing to go off of. I'd seen the truck turn right at the turnoff, so somewhere north of here, she must have died. And maybe, just maybe, I could figure out where. By morning, I still hadn't seen her, or any ghost for that matter. And after chatting with Tegan, my morning relief, I walked out to my car. But though I'd planned on driving home and getting some sleep, then searching later, I just couldn't resist the urge to look right then and there. And so, in my pass-and-go uniform and all, I walked over to the turnoff where I'd seen that phantom truck head right and then did the same, walking north up the road. The sun was just barely rising over the trees, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd appreciated a sunrise. Usually I sped home, trying to beat the sunlight to my room, where I could shut my blackout curtains and crash as if it were still night. Then I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But this morning, moving slowly up the road along the canal and constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary, I couldn't help but enjoy the orange glow above the trees. By the time I'd walked about 2 miles, the sun was fully above the horizon, and cars were starting to sparingly appear on 84th, though admittedly not many, as this wasn't the most direct route to anywhere in town except the pass and go. I'd already passed the infamous bend, and even felt obligated to pause there a moment before the canal, sort of waiting in reverent silence as I remembered the stare that biker had given me, the regret permeating his eyes. By now, though, it could no longer be considered a canal. It was a drainage ditch at best, a muddy, shallow dip off the road, and beyond it was the forest. But then in my steady scan of the ground in front of me, I noticed something twinkling. Crouched, looking down at small shards of glass on the pavement. Almost like a vision, my mind seemed to play out this simulation, and I was staring at the man as he and Amber argued. He lost his temper and slammed her head into the window, shattering. I noticed more twinkling coming from the grass before the ditch, and I could almost hear the sound of his boots scraping the asphalt as he kicked the glass off down the hill, trying to cover up anything that had happened. Then I noticed something, yellow peeking out of the mud. I stepped down into the ditch, grabbing the corner of the plastic and pulling it out of its muddy tomb. Sitting in my hand was a faded, dirty bag of Lay's Classic, mostly empty, with just a few crumbs at the bottom. My heart raced as I recalled her placing the bag on the counter, and again, I could see it before my mind's eye. Man dragging her body out of the passenger seat, her dead-weight foot scraping the bag out with her. He probably didn't even notice in his panic as he dragged her toward the forest, the bag fluttering off down into the ditch below. I walked up the hill on the other side. I stepped into the forest. My breathing started to become heavy as I walked deeper into the trees, terrified as I anticipated just what nightmarish spectacle I might be about to find. But I wouldn't turn back now. And as the afterimage of Amber's conflicted eyes appeared in my mind again, I resolved to find where she was buried so I could finally give her parents peace, maybe even give her peace. And it didn't take much more walking to find clues. I noticed 2 hardly visible scrapes in the dirt, where her shoes must have been dragging. I carefully followed them, stepping off toward a cluster of trees as they suddenly turned, at last freezing before what I could immediately ascertain was a shallow grave. The grass all around it was undisturbed, but here, in just this plot, was a clump of uneven earth. Some grass and leaves had been precariously scattered on top in the man's frantic attempt to conceal it, but it wasn't convincing. And as I crouched before the plot, my heart began to thump out of my chest. But I gulped and steeled myself, knowing I had to see this all the way through for Amber. I wished I had a shovel, but with nothing else, I just dug with my hands, scraping the dirt away and trying not to consider the possibility of my fingers abruptly touching her corpse. I jerked as I felt something that wasn't soil, didn't feel like rotting flesh. So I brushed the sand away, and my eyes centered upon a filthy blue tarp immured in the ground. It was all I needed to see. I stayed, right there, pulling out my phone and calling the police. And when they arrived within the hour, I told them I'd gone on a morning walk after getting off the graveyard shift, but noticed the broken glass and trash on the side of the road. They applauded me on my intuition, saying they probably wouldn't have found that suspicious at all. And hell, I certainly wouldn't have either if I hadn't known the context. From there, I said I walked into the forest out of curiosity, but when I found what looked to be a trail left by dragging feet, I became convinced I'd actually found something serious. And after a little bit of digging where the ground looked abnormal, I'd seen the tarp and assumed the worst. They were kinder than cops had ever been with me as they thanked me, and in just a couple of days, it was confirmed in a news story that wrapped in that tarp and left to rot in the woods off 84th Avenue for the last half a year was none other than the body of Amber Wicker, the girl with black hair and big brown eyes, taking her next big step in life, the last big step she'd ever take. I was glad I had been able to help her family get some closure and, hell, even lead to the arrest of the bastard that killed her, whose DNA was recovered at the scene of the crime. But even still, at the end of the day, none of that would bring her back. I just felt hollow, finding her body, providing her parents whatever relief they could find, and putting that monster in jail still wouldn't bring that innocent, naive girl back to life. And as I listened to a podcast on the graveyard shift on my last night of work at the Pass and Go, 4 days before I'd be heading off to college, I found myself constantly distracted thinking about that. But slowly I got my mind off things, paying more attention to the podcast and starting to stare off into space at last, the shift beginning to fly by. Until just after 4 in the morning, I gasped as the neon sign flickered. I darted over to the side of the counter and peered over the cigarettes. I'll never be able to describe the feeling in my chest at the sight of that old red truck. And though I felt ice in my veins at the afterimage of Amber's killer pumping gas in the dark, when I found her walking to the front of the store, all that remained in my heart was an overwhelming longing, an inconsolable despair. She walked to the store, the chime on the ceiling ringing as she headed right over to the snacks. I stared at her undamaged body, her clean black hair, her innocent big brown eyes. I became emotional at the sight of it, trying desperately not to cry. She grabbed the bag of Lay's. Then she walked over to the sports drinks, and I leaned against the counter, my chin in my palm as I gazed at this specter retracing the final moments of her life, none the wiser to the horrible demise awaiting her 2 miles away. She grabbed a red Gatorade, then walked over to me, and I felt breathless as she approached, unsure of what I'd even say. "Whoa, you all right?" She looked at me, and I must have been hiding how I felt even worse than I realized. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, scanning the items like a robot. I cleared my throat. "What brings you out here this late?" "Nothing really." The total came up on the screen. "Big brother?" I limply asked, nudging my head toward the heartless man in the dark, you know. It's gross to have a brother. I must have asked the question differently this time, because she stared deeper at me, asking again, "You sure you're okay, dude?" God, I wanted so badly to tell her to run, to just get the fuck out of here, to not ever go near that man again. I wanted to tell her that she was about to die, that he was her murderer, that these were the very final minutes of her life. But this was not a time machine. It was no different than that Facebook page from years ago. Just a memory inexplicably suspended in time, just a brief expression of her existence that was as ephemeral an experience as her time on Earth, and nothing more. "Can I ask you something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Have you ever done something totally crazy, just overnight?" She blinked wildly, visibly taken aback by the words. "Yeah, actually," she murmured. "Yeah, I have." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged. "No reason." "What? About you?" "Yeah, I did once. I had this weird inkling to follow a trail into the woods, and I found a body, called the police and reported it." "Creepy," she remarked. I let out a long sigh, handing her the stuff. "Hey, this is on me tonight, all right?" "Oh, sure. How come?" "You just look like a friend of mine," I smiled hollowly. "A friend I haven't seen in a while." Anyway, it's my treat. Well, all right. Thanks. She took her unceremonious last meal, then turned over to the door, walking toward the oscillating neon. Have a good rest of your night, Carter. She glanced at my name tag, smiling slightly at me. It broke my heart. You too, Amber. Huh? I said you too. She stood there a moment, as if debating whether or not she'd heard me right the first time. Then she turned around and walked outside. But I couldn't just sit there, and before I knew it, I was running around the counter, shoving the doors open and stepping outside. I bit my tongue at the gash on the back of her head, the blood dripping down her hair and onto the back of her top. I had guessed that had been the cause of her death, but evidently I was wrong. Because as she turned back toward me, I found her blue face and the purplish bruising of a seatbelt around her neck. Her clothes were covered in dirt and blood, and the Lay's bag was empty and faded. Mud clumped all over it. The bottle of Gatorade was halfway empty. I trembled as I found her teary gaze, the desperation and regret staining her painfully cognizant. Big brown eyes, not innocent anymore. Thank you, she whispered. I couldn't possibly muster a response. And then Amber turned, the afterimage of her corpse climbing into the passenger side door of her murderer's truck. I remained frozen in place, my eyes following every last fleeting second of Amber's existence as the taillights glowed and the engine hummed. Then the truck pulled off, pausing at the turnoff. And then, as it pulled away, turning right on 84th Avenue and heading to her shallow grave, the neon of the sign stopped flickering, leaving me standing there alone again in silence. Make it a headshot. Shoot me in the temple, aiming slightly downwards. I need the bullet to travel the shortest possible distance through my brain before it hits my hippocampus. If I'm lucky, the sensation of the gunshot ripping through my skull will only last a few decades. As awful as this sounds, you'll be doing me an enormous favor. Death by a headshot, as soon as possible, is vastly better than the alternative. My ordeal started over 10,000 years ago at 10:15 this morning. I earn extra money by participating in drug trials. I'm a so-called healthy subject who takes experimental drugs to help assess side effects. Once it was a kidney drug. A few times it's been something for blood pressure or cholesterol. This morning they told me the drug I took was a psychoactive substance intended to accelerate brain function. None of the drugs I had tested so far have ever done anything for me in the recreational sense. In other words, none of the drugs I've tested have given me a killer buzz or mellowed me out or anything. Maybe I've always ended up in the placebo group, but nothing I've tested has affected me at all. Today's drug was different. This shit worked. They gave me a pill at 10:15 and told me to hang out in the waiting room until they called me back for some tests. Only about 30 minutes, the research assistant told me. I flopped onto the waiting room couch and read a few articles from a copy of Psychology Today that was sitting on the coffee table. They hadn't called me back when I finished the Psychology Today, so I picked up a US News and read it cover to cover. Then, I read an old Scientific American. What was taking them so damn long? I sluggishly turned my head to look at the wall clock. It was only 10:23 a.m. I had read all 3 magazines in 8 minutes. I remember thinking this was going to be a long day. I was right. The waiting room had a little bookshelf with some used hardcovers on it. When I stood up to walk to the AO bookshelf, it felt like my legs barely worked. It's not that they were weak. They were just slow. It took a full minute just to stand up off the couch and another minute to take 2 steps to the bookcase. I scanned the old books on the shelf and picked out a copy of Moby Dick. My arms had the same problems as my legs. Just reaching 1 foot in front of me to grab the book took a long time. I actually got bored just waiting for my hand to reach the spine of the book. I slogged back to the couch and collapsed onto it in a slow-motion fall that reminded me of the low-gravity hops of astronauts on the moon. I opened Moby Dick, slowly, and began reading. I started with Call Me Ishmael and got as far as Ahab throwing his pipe into the sea, which was all the way to friggin' chapter 30, before they called me back. How are you feeling? The research assistant asked me. I feel slow, I said. Actually, it's the other way around. Everything seems slow because you're so fast. But my legs, my arms, they're moving in slow motion. Your body seems like it's moving slowly because your brain is fast. Your brain is running 10 or 20 times faster than normal. You are thinking and perceiving reality at an accelerated pace, but your body is still constrained by the laws of biomechanics. Frankly, you're moving much faster than a normal person. She pantomimed a jogging motion. But your brain is running so much faster right now that even your fast walk seems very slow to you. I thought about my slow-motion flop onto the waiting room couch. Even if my muscles had slowed down, my body would still react to gravity the same way. But in the waiting room, I even fell in slow motion. Slow muscles couldn't explain why gravity seemed weaker. My brain was going at warp 10. That's how I managed to read 3 magazines and the first 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. They ran a series of tests on me. The physical tests were fun. They made me juggle 3 balls, then 4, then 6. I had no problem keeping 6 balls in the air because they seemed to be moving so slowly. It was boring, frankly, waiting for each ball to move through its arc so I could catch it with my slow-motion hands and toss it back into the air. They threw Cheerios in the air and I caught them with chopsticks. They dropped a handful of coins, and I counted the total value before they hit the ground. Cognitive tests were less fun, but very illuminating. Finish a 50-word word search, 3 seconds. Solve an intricate maze drawn onto a poster-sized paper, 2 seconds. View a slideshow projected at 10 images per second, and answer detailed questions about what I saw. 95% correct. They told me I measured over 250 on the Knopp scale. Apparently that's deep into the superhuman range of thinking speeds. Then they sent me home. It'll wear off in a few hours, they said, which will seem like days to you. Try to use the residual effects to get some work done. Catch up on work emails while you're still in high-speed mode. The ride home was horrible. It was only 3 metro stops, and in real-world time, it only took about 35 minutes. But in my drug-accelerated hypertime, it felt like days. Days. Just walking out of the medical research suite to the elevator seemed like it took an hour. I sprinted out of the office, willing my legs to push me faster. But the laws of biomechanics held me prisoner. As accelerated as my brain was, I couldn't do anything to make my legs work faster. The huge disconnect between my body and mind made it extremely difficult to judge how and when to slow down, turn, or rotate my body. I had basically turned into a giant slow-motion spaz. I misjudged my speed and rammed into the wall by the elevator button at a pretty good speed. Even though I could see the wall coming at me, I couldn't make my finger outstretched to hit the elevator button, move away fast enough, and I jammed it against the wall. Hard. The pain was intense. If my brain had been running at regular speed, it probably only would have hurt for 30 seconds or so. But in my accelerated state, the intense pain seemed to last for half an hour. 45 minutes, maybe. The elevator ride was horrible. It felt like I spent 4 or 5 hours just descending 7 floors, with nothing to look at but the interior of the elevator car. I sprinted to the metro station. I have to admit, this part was almost fun. Even though my body moved at what seemed to me to be super slow speed, I could still carefully choose how and where to place my feet, swing my arms, and turn my torso. It only took a block or two to get used to having a brain that ran 24 times faster than my body. Then I basically sprint danced the rest of the way, twisting and juking between people on the sidewalk and dodging moving cars with inches, aka minutes, of clearance. I spent an hour, in my time frame, descending into the subway and running to the platform. Endless tedium waiting the 6 minutes for the Red Line train to arrive. Although there was more to look at on the metro platform than inside the elevator, it was still intensely boring. I should have stolen that copy of Moby Dick. The Red Line train roared into the station in slow motion. The normally high-pitched squeal of its brakes was frequency shifted by my high-speed mind to a long, low tone, like a monotone tuba solo. Wasn't just the squealing subway train that was 3 octaves lower than normal. All sound was slowed to the point of near inaudibility. Voices were gone, shifted below the threshold frequency of my hearing. I did manage to hear a screaming baby on my subway car. Her shrieks slowed to sound like whale songs. Sharp sounds, like a car horns and trucks bouncing over potholes, were low. Muddied roars like distant thunder. Back at the research offices, I could still hear and communicate with the research staff. But now, verbal communication with anyone would be impossible. The effects of the drug were still intensifying. I spent what seemed like days on that fucking red line train. Days. Listening to the wail song of the screaming baby and the tuba solo of the brakes. Where ordinary voices were frequency shifted out of my audio range, smells didn't seem to be affected. I never became nose-blind to the body odor, the stench of the train's brakes, and melange of farts and other smells wafting. Through the metro car, I finally got back to my apartment. Sprinting through my open door and into the front hall at full speed was like a slow, relaxing drift down a lazy river. I was relieved to be home. At least I had stuff I could do there. I picked up the book I was reading, 100 Years of Solitude, and finished it. Despite turning the pages so quickly that I tore many of them, it seemed like most of the time I spent finishing the book was spent on page turning and not actually reading. 3 minutes had passed since I got home. I tried surfing the internet. My God, it takes a long time for computers to boot these days, but it was too frustratingly slow. Hours, seemingly, to load each new page, and a fraction of a second to read it. 100 articles in my newsfeed read, and just 3 more minutes. Done. I dipped into my pile of yet-to-be-read books and finished 2 more. 4 more minutes had passed. I decided to try to sleep off the remaining effects of the drug. Unfortunately, whatever part of my mind is responsible for perception, the part that's been accelerated to hyperspeeds by the drug, isn't the same as the part that governs sleep. Despite being awake for what I perceived as days, my physical brain still thought it was 1:25 p.m. It was not ready for sleep. Nevertheless, I tried to sleep. I walked to my bedroom, a slow 45-minute drift through my apartment, and flung myself into bed, lazily falling like a feather onto the mattress. I closed my eyes and lay there for hours and hours, 10 minutes, reality time, before giving up. Sleep would not come. I was facing what was going to feel like days or maybe even weeks of being trapped in a slow-motion prison. So I took an Ambien, the sensation of the pill and the splash of water I used. To swallow it sliding down my throat was sickening, a lump that blocked my breathing, moving like a slug down my esophagus. I read a book. 10 minutes had passed. I read another. 18 minutes since I took the Ambien. I threw the book across the room in disgust at my situation. The book slowly pirouetted and spun through the air, like a leaf blowing in a breeze. It hit the wall with a long, faint rumble, the only sound I had heard for what seemed like hours, and then drifted to the floor like a flip-flop sinking in a swimming pool. Force of gravity hadn't changed since I took the pill. The laws of physics were the same. It was just my perception of time that had gone wackadoo. This meant I could use the speed things seemed to fall as a way of judging the effects of the drug, based on how long it took the book to drift to the floor. I estimated the effects of the drug were still intensifying. I read a magazine. I turned on the television. I clearly saw each frame of video like I was watching a slideshow. Frustrated, I turned the television off. I read some more. The first 2 books of Churchill's A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Not exactly a light read. Frankly, I hated it. But given the hours of tedium it would take to go get another book off my bookshelf, just sitting on the couch and reading Churchill was better. Or at least less worse. It had now been 35 minutes since I took the Ambien. I lay down on the couch and closed my eyes. Time passed, I inhaled, a hours-long process. Time passed, I exhaled for more hours. Sleep would not come. I needed a new plan. I decided to go back to the offices where they gave me the drug. Maybe they would have something that could counteract its effects, or at least something to knock me out until it wore off. I exited my apartment as fast as possible, taking hours, my time frame to do so. I didn't even bother locking the door. Would have taken too long. Down the stairs, it's faster than the elevator if you run. Through the lobby, out the front door, and onto the street. These few things felt like a long day at the office, sprinting down the street, dancing and weaving, between pedestrians with what must have looked to them superhuman dexterity. Down the first flight of stairs at the metro, across the landing, another hour, then onto the second flight of stairs. That's when the Ambien hit me. The Ambien didn't make me sleepy. Not at all. Instead, it must have had a severe cross-reaction with the experimental drug I took this morning. I was bounding down the second flight of stairs, moving in slow motion, but still making perceptible progress. Then, wham! Everything stopped. The dull roar of the street and metro noise ceased, replaced by the most perfect silence I've ever experienced. My downwards motion seemed to completely freeze. Before the Ambien kicked in, my perception of time was maybe a few hundred times slower than real time. After the Ambien took effect, time moved thousands of times slower. Every second seemed like days to me. Even just moving my eyes to focus on a new point was like an impossibly slow scroll across my visual field. Over the course of the afternoon, I learned how to walk, run, and jump when my mind ran hundreds of times faster than my body. But with another 4 or 5 orders of magnitude of slowdown caused by the Ambien, body control was almost impossible. I fell on the stairs. Even though I was all but frozen in mid-step, controlling my muscles was impossible. I commanded my foot forwards for hours, then backwards for hours more when it seemed like I would miss the next step. Hours attempting to adjust the angle of my ankle, then readjusting when it felt wrong. Despite these efforts, I rolled my ankle on the next step. The pain wasn't at all mitigated by the slowness. Hours of increasing strain on my bent ankle. The nerve signals that send pain into the brain must work differently than the nerves in my ear. Sonic energy was spread out over time, diluted until it was imperceptible. Pain flowed into my brain undiluted by the change in my perception of time. Hours and hours of increasing weight on my turned ankle turned into hours of increasing pain upon increasing pain. I pitched forwards, my high-speed mind completely unable to control my low-speed body. I drifted downwards for days, managing to rotate my torso enough to keep my head from impacting the ground first. I eventually landed on my right shoulder. At first, the impact wasn't even noticeable. Then I felt a slight pressure in my shoulder as it came in contact with the ground. The pressure grew, bringing increasing pain for hour upon hour. My shoulder finally gave out, popping out of its socket with an endless sickening tug. I came to a stop days later, crumpled onto the ground, staring at the ceiling. The pain in my shoulder still screaming with the intensity of a fresh, violent injury. I had plenty of time to think during that fall. If every second seemed like days to me, then each minute of real-world time would be like years. Even if the drug cleared out of my system in the next 2 or 3 hours, this nightmare would seem to last centuries. By the time I hit the ground, I had a plan. I would somehow get to the platform and throw myself in front of a train. I twisted onto my hands and knees, days of my dislocated shoulder crying for relief. I misjudged my rotation and rolled onto my back. I tried again, collapsing onto my face, as I tried to figure out how to control a body that moved slower than grass grew. Weeks of effort were finally rewarded with success. I stabilized on my hands and knees. If just getting on all fours was this difficult, I figured that walking or running was completely out of the question. So I crawled. I crawled through the metro tunnel. The dumb looks on the faces in the crowd lingered on me for weeks. I crawled under the turnstile and onto the escalator. The escalator spilled the rush hour crowd onto the platform at the same speed a glacier spills ice into the Saya. I looked out over the crowded platform during my interminable downward ride. The train status sign said the next train wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes was like a year to me. I'd have to spend a year on the metro platform, waiting to die. I crawled off the escalator, enduring days of stupid expressions on the commuters' faces. I crawled a few feet to a concrete bench and curled up next to it, trying to find a position to lessen the pain in my shoulder. Then my problem with time got worse. Impossibly worse. The massive slowdown on the stairs was just the beginning of the interaction between the experimental drug and the Ambien. It fully hit me while I was curled up by the bench. I blinked. Years of darkness followed. Sound was already gone, and with my blink, sight was gone as well. All that existed was the pain from my fall. My hyper-accelerated mind wasted no time, compensating for the lack of sensory input. Voices spoke to me. They sung to me in languages that never existed. Patterns and faces and colors came and went in my mind's eye. I recalled my whole life and imagined living another. I forgot English. I settled into a profound despair. I spoke to God. I became God. I imagined a new universe and brought it to life with my thoughts. Then I did it all again, and again. My eyes opened with geologic slowness. A faint glow. Weeks. A slit of light. Weeks. A narrow view of the metro. Platform. Ankles of the commuters near me, and an advertisement on the opposite wall. I extracted my phone from my pocket. A project that spanned decades. How can I even explain the boredom? The pain in my shoulder is nothing compared to the boredom. Every thought I can think, I have thought hundreds of times already. The view of ankles and advertisements never changes. Never. The boredom is so intense it's tangible, like a solid object of metal and stone wedged into my skull. Inescapable. What are my options? If I crawl and fall onto the tracks without an oncoming train to crush me, I won't die. I'll experience even more pain from the 4-foot fall, but I'll most likely be rescued by some do-gooder on the platform and unable to act when the train finally does arrive. My suffering in that scenario will be endless, so I wait for the train, so I can throw myself under it. When it finally hits me, I will experience the pain of being ripped to pieces for centuries until finally, the light of life leaves my brain, and my experience ends. I've lived hundreds of lifespans at the foot of this bench. I am far older in spirit than any human who has ever lived. Most of my life experience has been a snapshot of pain huddled on the floor of a subway platform, with an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. This post is my plan B, my Hail Mary, my long shot. I've spent lifetimes typing and posting this message in the hope that someone will read it and become convinced that my suffering must end. Someone on this platform, right now. Someone who will find the man curled under the bench, the man who crawled down the escalator, and kill him as swiftly as possible. A bullet to the temple. Let's start story, for the long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to stretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone through the branches of the tall green trees danced across the window in random patterns, and every once in a while it obnoxiously shone in your eyes. The surroundings were full of deep green trees, forming a forest around the road. The only sound was the sound of the car's engine as it traveled down the path. It was peaceful and left a serene feeling. Although the ride seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice from its two passengers. The middle-aged woman, behind the steering wheel, had neat, short brown hair that fit her complexion quite well. She wore a green V-neck t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. Diamond stud earrings decorated each of her ears, which partially showed from behind her haircut. She had deep green eyes which her shirt brought out, and the lighting seemed to make them more noticeable. There wasn't anything significant about her appearance. She looked like any other average mother you would see on TV shows and the like. However, the one thing that made her different than the average mothers was the dark bags she had under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like someone who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while, and occasionally glance in the rearview mirror to look at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over partially, with his arms held tight around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance, and anyone could plainly see there was something wrong with him. His messy brown hair went every which way, and the luminescent lighting brought out his pale, almost gray skin. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's, and he wore a white t-shirt and scrub pants that had been provided for him by the hospital. Clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared, a few cuts along with a split eyebrow, His right arm was bandaged all the way to the shoulder, which had been shredded when his right side hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, when in reality he couldn't feel anything. This was just one of the glories of being him. One of the challenges he had to face while growing up was growing up with a rare disease that caused him to be completely numb towards pain. Never before had he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. The other major disorder he had faced, which was the one that earned him many insulting nicknames in the short time he attended grade school before he switched to homeschooling, was his Tourette's syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Teachy Toby, and they mocked him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad he had to turn to homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking or more like stabbing fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window, his face empty of any emotion, and every few minutes his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump that the car tires hit would make his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last time Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he remembered, before he blacked out over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one. His sister had not been so lucky. When the thought of his sister came, he couldn't help the tears that welled up in his eyes. The horrible memories replayed in his mind. Her screaming that had cut off when the front of the car was smashed in. It all went blank for a moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body. Her forehead pierced with glass shards, her hips and legs crushed under the force of the steering wheel, and her torso pushed in from the Thule-inflated airbag. That was the last thing he had seen of his dear older sister. The road home continued on for what seemed like forever. It took so long to get home because his mom wanted to avoid the sight of the crash. When the surroundings gave way to a familiar neighborhood, they were both more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. It was an older neighborhood with quaint little houses all next to each other. The car drove in front of a blue house with white window panes. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle that was parked in front of the house and the familiar figure that stood in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration take over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car up in the driveway beside him before turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly as he looked back at his mother, who reached to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you," his mother responded in a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky, yet couldn't drive up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died. Toby narrowed his eyes out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah. When is he not?" Toby pushed the door open before his mother and stumbled out onto the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met her husband's eyes before walking around the car. His father opened up his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arm around Toby's shoulder and started leading him inside. "Connie," her husband began in a raspy voice. "What, no welcome home hug, huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and walked past him with her son under her arm. "Hey, he's 16. He can walk by himself." His father began to follow them in. "He's 17. Connie glared back at him before opening the door to the house and stepping inside. "Toby, why don't we get you in your room to rest, okay? I'll come get you when dinner's ready." "No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself," Toby said sarcastically, and glared back at his father before stumbling up the small staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it, just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and his walls had a few picture frames of his family, back when they were a family, before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently toward the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mom, and he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her to the floor, and when Lyra had tried to break it up, he pushed her, and she hit her back on the corner of the kitchen counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and sister. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beat him down. He couldn't feel it anyway. What he did care about was how he intentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he was waiting in the hospital where his sister took her last breaths, the only one who didn't rush there was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out at the street. He could have sworn he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but quickly blamed it on the meds he was on. When dinner time had come and his mother called up to him, Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father and in between his mother and an empty chair. It was quiet as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught on to his staring and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly and then down at his uneaten food, which he still didn't touch. Toby lay in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way he would fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father, or continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard his door creak open, and his mother padded into the room and sat on the bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you it will get better," she said softly. "When is he going to leave?" Toby said with an innocent tone. In his shaky voice, Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. "I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned in to kiss his cheek and stood up to walk out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tires, the screaming of his sister, and he would uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his cover and, lying on his back, he pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he hadn't pressed his pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streaming from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't stop the whining and whimpering as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window and peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly, and his gaze slowly centered on something standing under the streetlight. He heard ringing in his ears and couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the streetlight, about 2 feet shorter than it did, long arms draped at its sides as it stared up at him with non-existing eyes. The figure had no facial features to speak of. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder each second he stared before suddenly it all went black. The next morning, Toby woke in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all. And when he consciously woke up, it felt like he had been lying there awake for hours. He had no thoughts flowing through his mind. He sat up slowly and stumbled over to the wall, but when he stood, he automatically felt dizzy. He stumbled to the doorway and walked down the stairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was tuned in to the small TV that sat on the countertop, and his mother was reading the newspaper. She quickly looked over when she felt Toby's presence looming behind her. "Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You've been sleeping forever," she greeted him with a hesitant smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed that it was 12:30 p.m. "I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you, but I felt you needed sleep." Her expression fell from happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her. "Are you all right?" Toby stumbled over and sat by his father. He felt as if he was on idle and had no control over his actions. He was seeing everything he did, but I didn't register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arm, but his hand ended up getting slapped. His father turned to him abruptly and pushed his chair over with his foot. "Don't touch me, boy," he yelled. His mother stood up. "All right, knock that off. That is the last thing we need." The days went by, and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning the house, and her rude husband spent most of his time ordering her around. It was just like how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit by his bed and tremble. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed too fast to be remembered. He would pace around his small room like a caged animal or stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being way too submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he would begin to chew on his hands, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hands until they bled. When his mother walked in on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs and grabbed the first aid kit, wrapping his hands in bandages. Afterward, she demanded that he wouldn't leave her side again. Toby isolated himself so much that he grew to hate being around others. His memory grew glitchy as well. He'd start missing memory of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He would begin talking nonsense about things completely unrelated to the conversations he would have. He'd go off about seeing things, sharks in the sink as he washed the dishes, hearing crickets in his pillows, and seeing ghosts outside his bedroom window. His mother grew so anxious about his mental health that she decided it would be good for him to talk to a professional about what he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hand and guiding him in. She walked him up to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind it. "Mrs. Rogers?" the lady asked. "Yes, that's me," Connie nodded. "We're here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Toby Rogers." "Yes, write this." "Oui." The lady stood and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the halls and tuned in to the sound of the lady's high heels on the hardwood floor. She opened the door to a room with a table and 2 chairs. "If we can get him to sit in here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor." She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. He looked over at his mother and the lady before the door slowly shut behind them. He looked around the room before he held up his tightly bandaged hands and began to bite at the bandages to unwrap his hands. But he was interrupted as the door swung open, and a young woman in a black and spotted dress with light blonde hair stepped, holding a clipboard and a pen. "Toby?" she asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver." She put her hand out for him to shake, but hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands. "Oh," she smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting in the chair across the table from him. "So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer them as honestly as possible, okay?" She placed her clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands in his lap. "How old are you, Toby?" 17, he responded quietly. She wrote that down on the paper that was clipped to the clipboard. "What is your full name?" "Toby Aaron Rogers." "When is your birthday?" "April 28th. "Who is your immediate family?" Toby paused for a minute before answering her question. "My mom, my dad, and—" He stopped. "My sister. I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry." Her expression faded into a sad, pity-filled look. Toby nodded. "Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby?" Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down at his lap, and in the surrounding area, he heard a faint ringing sound. His eyes widened, and he froze in place. "Toby?" the counselor asked. "Toby, are you listening?" Toby felt a shiver go down his spine until he froze once again, and slowly looked over out the little window through the door, where he saw it. A dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, eyes widened, the ringing growing louder and louder until suddenly the loud voice of the counselor broke his trance. "Toby!" she yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and backed up into the corner. Dr. Oliver stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest, a surprised look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again, his breath hitching as he twitched. That night, Toby lay in bed. His eyes were dazed as he stared straight up at his ceiling. He could feel himself begin to doze off when he heard the scattering of footsteps down his hallway. He sat up and looked towards the doorway, his door wide open. There was no light. Everything was lit by the luminescent blue glow of the moon through his window, leaving a cold lighting. He stood up and slowly made his way toward the doorway, when suddenly the door, which previously was wide open, slammed in his face. He gasped and fell back. He was out of breath when he hit the ground, and he began breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. He waited for a few seconds before getting back on his feet. He reached out and grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand, and it creaked open. He looked out into the dark hallway and tiptoed out of his room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up the darkness with blue moonlight as he padded his way down. He could hear footsteps rustling around him, and faint giggling followed by the pitter-patter of small feet, which sounded like a child had run in front of him, giggling and running around. The hallway was a lot longer than he remembered. It seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard the door creak in front of him. "Mom?" he called in a shaky voice. Suddenly a door slammed behind him and he jumped and turned around. Behind him, he heard a long, eerie groan that sounded like a croak right in his ear. He turned around as fast as he could and was suddenly face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded white, her skin pale, the right side of her jaw dangling there by tissue and muscle, glass protruding from her forehead, black blood leaking down her face, her blonde hair pulled up in a ponytail as it always was, and she was wearing her gray t-shirt and athletic shorts, which were dirty and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in ways they shouldn't be. She stood emitting a long, croaking noise only an inch away from Toby's face. Toby yelped and fell. Back. Ah! He started to crawl backward away from her, but he was unable to break the eye contact he held with her blank, dead eyes. He dragged himself backward until he backed up into something. He stopped for a second. Everything was dead silent except for his heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blank face of a tall, dark figure, the same figure that stood over him now. Behind the tall, dark mass were rows of children looking to range from 3 to 10 years old, their eyes completely black, and dark black blood leaked from their eye sockets. He screamed and stood up as fast as he could, only to be tripped by dark black tendrils that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight on his stomach and got the wind knocked out of him. He tried to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. He wheezed out before it all went black. Toby woke with a start. He screamed out and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed out and held his chest with his bandaged hands. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He lay back down on his bed and rolled over on his side. It felt like a great weight had been lifted off his chest as he took in deep breaths. He stood up and padded over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghosts, no figures, nothing. He heard the rustling and coughing of his father outside the doorway. His door was closed. He walked over and opened it. Looking out into the hallway once again, he padded down the hallway and into the kitchen, where he found his dad standing and having a smoke in their living room. Toby waited for a second and watched him from around the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep, boiling anger overtook him. He heard the little imaginary voices in his head. "Do it, do it, do it," they chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, unlike he did for the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts for just moments before the chanting of the little voices in his head clouded them. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. They continued on. Toby trembled. No. No. He wasn't going to do it. What was he going crazy? No, he won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father. But there was no way he was going to kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into an idle state once again. The influence of the voices in his head was too much. He began to silently walk up behind his father. He reached over the counter to the knife in the case. He gripped it in his hand. He felt the sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. Ha 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 ha. He began laughing so hard he had to gasp for breath. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shove him to the floor. He grunted as the air was knocked out of him. "What?" He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. "Toby, what are you doing?" He went to sit up and put his arms out in front of him in self-defense. But before he knew it, Toby was on top of him. He went to grab his neck, but his father reached out and blocked his hand by grabbing onto his wrist. "Stop. Get off of me, you little fucker," he yelled, and with his other hand, he threw an off-center punch towards Toby's shoulder, but he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if a demon had taken control of him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but his father blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He went to shove him back, but Toby kicked his feet out in front of him and landed a hard blow straight to his father's face. His father recoiled and pulled his arms away to cuff his face, but Toby got back up and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a loud cry and went to pull the knife out, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face. He began to pound his fists into his head, laughing and wheezing. He cracked his neck and grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his father's shoulder. He drove it deep into his dad's chest and repeatedly stabbed into his torso, blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body went still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over his body, coughing and panting. He stared at his father's smashed-in face and sat there twitching until a loud scream broke the silence. He looked over to see his mother standing a few feet away, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Toby," she screamed. "Why did you do that?" She cried. "Why?" She screamed. Toby stood up and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down at the blood-soaked bandages on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran into the garage and slammed his hand against the control panel on the wall and pushed the button to open the garage door. Before he ran out, he noticed his father's hatchets, which had been hanging on the tool rack above a table full of jars filled to the brim with old rusted nails and screws. One of the hatchets was new. It had a bright orange handle and a shiny blade, and the other was old with a wooden handle and an old, dull blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table, and he saw a box of matches, and under the table was a red gasoline tank. He held both of the hatchets in one hand and grabbed 2 matches and gasoline before running out of the garage, down the driveway, and up the street. As he approached the streetlight that he could see out his own bedroom window, he heard police sirens in the distance. He turned around, and the red and blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second before he pulled open the cap on the gasoline tank and ran down the street, spilling gasoline all over the street after him. He turned and ran into the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline out before he reached into his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box and immediately dropped it. In an instant, flames burst around him. The fire caught on the trees and bushes around him, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. The silhouettes of police cars were visible through the flames as he backed away into the forest around him. He looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding, and he closed his eyes for a moment. This was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with long bony fingers resting on his shoulder. He followed the arm that was attached to the hand up to a dark, towering figure. It appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and its face was completely blank. It towered over Toby's small frame as it looked down on him. Tendrils reached out from its back. Before Toby knew it, his vision blurred, and he heard the sound of ringing in his ears. Everything went blank. That was it. That was the end. That was how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. His sister Lori sat next to her drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie lost her husband and her son, and a few weeks before, she had lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping her busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago. The focus of the world seemed to have shifted to completely new stories. Lori switched the TV on to a news broadcast. On the TV, the news reporter began introducing the new headline. "We have breaking news. Last night there was reported the murder of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. The investigators have discovered a weapon at the crime scene. It appears to be an old dull-blade hatchet, as you can see here. The picture changed to show snapshots of the weapon exactly as it was left at the crime scene. Investigators have pulled the name of a possible suspect, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who stabbed his father to death a few weeks ago and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets and forest area around the neighborhood. Although they believed the young boy had died in the fire, investigators suspect Rogers might still be alive due to the fact that his body was never found. Let's start story 5. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down on paper and not on my computer. I guess I've just noticed some odd things. It's not that I don't trust the computer. I just need to organize my thoughts. I need to get down all the details somewhere objective, somewhere I know that what I write can't be deleted or changed. Not that that's happened. It's just everything blurs together here, and the fog of memory lends a strange cast to things. I'm starting to feel cramped in this small apartment. Maybe that's the problem. I just had to go and choose the cheapest apartment, the only one in the basement. The lack of windows down here makes day and night seem to slip by seamlessly. I haven't been out in a few days because I've been working on this project so intensively. I suppose I just wanted to get it done. Hours of sitting and staring at a monitor can make anyone feel strange, I know. But I don't think that's it. I'm not sure when I first started to feel like something was odd. I can't even define what it is. Maybe I just haven't talked to anyone in a while. That's the first thing that crept up on me. Everyone I normally talk to online while I program has been idle, or they've simply not logged on at all. My instant messages go unanswered. The last email I got from anybody was a friend saying he'd talk to me when he got back from the store, and that was yesterday. I'd call with my cell phone, but reception's terrible down here. Yeah, that's it. I just need to call someone. I'm going to go outside. Well, that didn't work so well. As the tingle of fear fades, I'm feeling a little ridiculous for being scared at all. I looked in the mirror before I went out, but I didn't shave the 2-day stubble I've grown. I figured I was just going out for a quick cell phone call. I did change my shirt, though, because it was lunchtime, and I guessed that I'd run into at least one person I knew. That didn't end up happening. I wish it did. When I went out, I opened the door to my small apartment slowly. A small feeling of apprehension had somehow already lodged itself in me for some indefinable reason. I chalked it up to having not spoken to anyone but myself for a day or two. I peered down the dingy gray hallway, made dingier by the fact that it was a basement hallway. On one end, a large metal door led to the building's furnace room. It was locked, of course. 2 dreary soda machines stood by it. I bought a soda from one the first day I moved in, but it had a 2-year-old expiration date. I'm fairly sure nobody knows those machines are even down here, or my cheap landlady just doesn't care to get them restocked. I closed my door softly and walked in the other direction, taking care not to make a sound. I have no idea why I chose to do that, but it was fun giving in to the strange impulse not to break the droning hum of the soda machines, at least for the moment. I got to the stairwell and took the stairs up to the building's front door. I looked through the heavy door's small square window and received quite the shock. It was definitely not lunchtime. City gloom hung over the dark street outside, and the traffic lights at the intersection in the distance blinked yellow. Dim clouds, purple and black from the glow of the city, hung overhead. Nothing moved, save the few sidewalk trees that shifted in the wind. I remember shivering, though. I wasn't cold. Maybe it was the wind outside. I could vaguely hear it through the heavy metal door, and I knew it was that unique kind of late-night wind, the kind that was constant, cold, and quiet, save for the rhythmic music it made as it passed through countless unseen tree leaves. Decided not to go outside. Instead, I lifted my cell phone to the door's little window and checked the signal meter. The bars filled up the meter, and I smiled. Time to hear someone else's voice, I remember thinking. Relieved. It was such a strange thing to be afraid of nothing. I shook my head, laughing at myself silently. I hit speed dial for my best friend, Amy's number, and held the phone up to my ear. It rang once, but then it stopped. Nothing happened. I listened to silence for a good 20 seconds, then hung up. I frowned and looked at the signal meter again, still full. I went to dial. Her number again, but then my phone rang in my hand, startling me. I put it up to my ear. "Hello?" I asked, immediately fighting down a small shock at hearing the first spoken voice in days, even if it was my own. I had gotten used to the droning hum of the building's inner workings, my computer, and the soda machines in the hallway. There was no response to my greeting at first, but then finally a voice came. "Hey," said a clear male voice, obviously of college age like me. "Who's this?" "John," I replied, confused. "Oh, sorry, wrong number," he replied, then hung up. I lowered the phone slowly and leaned against the thick brick wall of the stairwell. That was strange. I looked at my received calls list, but the number was unfamiliar. Before I could think on it further, the phone rang loudly, shocking me yet again. This time, I looked at the caller before I answered. It was another unfamiliar number. This time, I held the phone up to my ear but said nothing. I heard nothing but the general background noise of a phone. Then a familiar voice broke my tension. "John," was the single word in Amy's voice. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, it's you," I replied. "Who else would it be?" She responded. "Oh, the number. I'm at a party on 7th Street and my phone died just as you called me. This is someone else's phone, obviously." "Oh, okay," I said. "Where are you?" she asked. My eyes glanced over the drab, whitewashed, cinder block walls and the heavy metal door with its small window. "At my building," I sighed. "Just feeling cooped up, I didn't realize it was so late. You should come here," she said, laughing. "Nah, I don't feel like looking for some strange place by myself in the middle of the night," I said, looking out the window at the silent, windy street that secretly scared me just a tiny bit. "I think I'm just going to keep working or go to bed." "Nonsense," she replied. "I can come get you. Your building is close to 7th Street, right?" "How drunk are you?" I asked lightheartedly. "You know where I live." "Oh, of course," she said abruptly. "I guess I can't get there by walking, huh?" "You could if you wanted to waste half an hour," I told her. "Right," she said. "Okay, I have to go. Good luck with your work." I lowered the phone once more, looking at the numbers flash as the call ended. Then, the droning silence suddenly reasserted itself in my ears. The two strange calls and the eerie street outside just drove home my aloneness in this empty stairwell. Perhaps from having seen too many scary movies, I had the sudden, inexplicable idea that something could look in the door's window and see me. Some sort of horrible entity that hovered at the edge of aloneness, just waiting to creep up on unsuspecting people that strayed too far from other human beings. I knew the fear was irrational, but nobody else was around, so I jumped down the stairs, ran down the hallway into my room, and closed the door as swiftly as I could while still staying silent. Like I said, I feel a little ridiculous for being scared of nothing, and the fear is already faded. Writing this down helps a lot. It makes me realize that nothing is wrong. It filters out half-formed thoughts and fears and leaves only cold, hard facts. It's late. I got a call from a wrong number, and Amy's phone died, so she called me back from another number. Nothing strange is happening. Still, there was something a little off about that conversation. I know it could have just been the alcohol she'd had, or was it even her that seemed off to me? Or was it, yes, that was it. I didn't realize it until this moment, writing these things down. I knew writing things down would help. She said she was at a party, but I only heard silence in the background. Of course, that doesn't mean anything in particular, as she could have just gone outside to make the call. No, that couldn't be it either. I didn't hear the wind. I need to see if the wind is still blowing. Monday, I forgot to finish writing last night. I'm not sure what I expected to see when I ran up the stairwell and looked out the heavy metal door's window. I'm feeling ridiculous. Last night's fear seems hazy and unreasonable to me now. I can't wait to go out into the sunlight. I'm going to check my email, shave, shower, and finally get out of here. Wait, I think I heard something. It was thunder. That whole sunlight and fresh air thing didn't happen. I went out into the stairwell and up the stairs, only to find disappointment. The heavy metal door's little window showed only flowing water, as torrential rain slammed against it. Only a very dim, gloomy light filtered in through the rain. But at least I knew it was daytime, even if it was a gray, sickly, wet day. I tried looking out the window and waiting for lightning to illuminate the gloom, but the rain was too heavy, and I couldn't make out anything more than vague, weird shapes moving at odd angles in the waves washing down the window. Disappointed, I turned around, but I didn't want to go back to my room. Instead, I wandered further up the stairs past the first floor and the second. The stairs ended at the third floor, the highest floor in the building. I looked through the glass that ran up the outer wall of the stairwell, but it was that warped, thick kind that scatters the light. Not that there was much to see through the rain to begin with. I opened the stairwell door and wandered down the hallway. The 10 or so thick wooden doors, painted blue a long time ago, were all closed. I listened as I walked, but it was the middle of the day, so I wasn't surprised that I heard nothing but the rain outside. As I stood there in the dim hallway, listening to the rain, I had the strange, fleeting impression that the doors were standing like silent granite monoliths, erected by some ancient, forgotten civilization for some unfathomable, guardian purpose. Lightning flashed, and I could have sworn that for just a moment the old grainy blue wood looked just like rough stone. I laughed at myself for letting my imagination get the best of me, but then it occurred to me that the dim glow and lightning must mean there was a window somewhere in the hallway. A vague memory surfaced, and I suddenly recalled that the third floor had an alcove and an inset window halfway down the floor's hallway. Excited to look out into the rain and possibly see another human being, I quickly walked over to the alcove, finding the large, thin glass window. Rain washed down it, as with the front door's window, but I could open this one. I reached a hand out to slide it open, but hesitated. I had the strangest feeling that if I opened that window, I would see something absolutely horrifying on the other side. Everything's been so odd lately, so I came up with a plan, and I came back here to get what I needed. I don't seriously think anything will come of it, but I'm bored, it's raining, and I'm going stir crazy. I came back to get my webcam. The cord isn't long enough to reach the third floor by any means, so instead, I'm going to hide it between the 2 soda machines in the dark end of my basement hallway, run the wire along the wall and under my door, and put black duct tape over the wire to blend it in with the black plastic strip that runs along the base of the hallway's walls. I know this is silly, but I don't have anything better to do. Well, nothing happened. I propped open the hallway to stairwell door, steeled myself, then flung the heavy front door wide open and ran like hell down the stairs to my room and slammed the door. I watched the webcam on my computer intently, seeing the hallway outside my door and most of the stairwell. I'm watching it right now, and I don't see anything interesting. I just wish the camera's position was different so that I could see out the front door. Hey, somebody's online! I got out an older, less functional webcam that I had in my closet to video chat with my friend online. I couldn't really explain to him why I wanted to video chat, but it felt good to see another person's face. He couldn't talk very long, and we didn't talk about anything meaningful, but I feel much better. My strange fear has almost passed. I would feel completely better, but there was something odd about our conversation. I know that I've said that everything has seemed odd, but still he was very vague in his responses. I can't recall one specific thing that he said, no particular name or place or event, but he did ask for my email address to keep in touch. Wait, I just got an email. I'm about to go out. I just got an email from Amy that asked me to meet her for dinner at the place we usually go to. I do love pizza, and I've just been eating random food from my poorly stocked fridge for days, so I can't wait. Again, I feel ridiculous about the odd couple of days I've been having. I should destroy this journal when I get back. Oh, another email. Oh my God. I almost left the email and opened the door. I almost opened the door, but I read the email. First, it was from a friend I hadn't heard from in a long time, and it was sent to a huge number of emails that must have been every person he had saved in his address list. It had no subject, and it said, simply, "Seen with your own eyes. Don't trust them. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" The words shock me, and I keep going over and over them. Is it a desperate email sent just as something happened? The words are obviously cut off without finishing. On any other day, I would have dismissed. This is spam from a computer virus or something, but the words, "seen with your own eyes." I can't help but read over this journal and think back on the last few days and realize that I have not seen another person with my own eyes or talked to another person face to face. The webcam conversation with my friend was so strange, so vague, so eerie now that I think about it. Was it eerie? Or is the fear clouding my memory? My mind toys with the progression of events I've written here, pointing out that I have not been presented with one single fact that I did not specifically give out unsuspectingly. The random, wrong number that got my name, and the subsequent strange return call from Amy, the friend that asked for my email address. I messaged him first when I saw him online, and then I got my first email a few minutes after that conversation. Oh my God, that phone call with Amy. I said over the phone. I said that I was within half an hour's walk of 7th Street. They know I'm near there. What if they're trying to find me? Where is everyone else? Why haven't I seen or heard anyone else in days? No. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. I need to calm down. This madness needs to end. I don't know what to think. I ran about my apartment furiously, holding my cell phone up to every corner to see if it got a signal through the heavy walls. Finally, in the tiny bathroom, near one ceiling corner, I got a single bar. Holding my phone there, I sent a text message to every number in my list. Not wanting to betray anything about my unfounded fears, I simply sent, "You seen anyone face to face lately?" At that point, I just wanted any reply back. I didn't care what the reply was or if I embarrassed myself. I tried to call someone a few times, but I couldn't get my head up high enough. And if I brought my cell phone down even an inch, it lost signal. Then I remembered the computer and rushed over to it, instant messaging everyone online. Most were idle or away from their computer. Nobody responded. My messages grew more frantic, and I started telling people where I was and to stop by in person for a host of barely passable reasons. I didn't care about anything by that point. I just needed to see another person. I also tore apart my apartment, looking for something that I might have missed, some way to contact another human being without opening the door. I know it's crazy. I know it's unfounded. But what if? What if? I just need to be sure. I taped the phone to the ceiling in case Tuesday the phone rang. Exhausted from last night's rampage, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to the phone ringing and ran into the bathroom, stood on the toilet, and flipped open the phone taped to the ceiling. It was Amy, and I feel so much better. She was really worried about me, and apparently had been trying to contact me since the last time I talked to her. She's coming over now, and yes, she knows where I am without me telling her. I feel so embarrassed. I'm definitely throwing this journal away before anyone sees it. I don't even know why I'm writing in it now. Maybe it's just because it's the only communication I've had at all since God knows when. I look like hell, too. I looked in the mirror before I came back in here. My eyes are sunken. My stubble is thicker, and I just look generally unhealthy. My apartment is trashed, but I'm not going to clean it up. I think I need someone else to see what I've been through. These past few days have not been normal. I am not one to imagine things. I know I have been the victim of extreme probability. I probably missed seeing another person a dozen times. I just happened to go out when it was late at night, or in the middle of the day when everyone was gone. Everything's perfectly fine. I know this now. Plus, I found something in the closet last night that has helped me tremendously. A television. I set it up just before I wrote this, and it's on in the background. Television has always been an escape for me, and it reminds me that there's a world beyond these dingy brick walls. I'm glad Amy's the only one that responded to me after last night's frantic pestering of everyone I could contact. She's been my best friend for years. She doesn't know it, but I count the day that I met her among one of the few moments of true happiness in my life. I remember that warm summer day fondly. It seems a different reality from this dark, rainy, lonely place. I feel like I spent days sitting in that playground, much too old to play, just talking with her and hanging around doing nothing at all. I still feel like I can go back to that moment sometimes, and it reminds me that this damn place is not all that there is. Finally, a knock on the door. I thought it was odd that I couldn't see her through the camera I hid between the two. Soda machines. Figured that it was bad positioning, like when I couldn't see out the front door. I should have known. After the knock, I yelled through the door jokingly that I had a camera between the soda machines because I was embarrassed myself that I had taken this paranoia so far. After I did that, I saw her image walk over to the camera and look down at it. She smiled and waved. "Hey," she said to the camera brightly, giving it a wry look. "It's weird, I know," I said, into the mic attached to my computer. "I've had a weird few days." "Must have," she replied. "Open the door, John." I hesitated. How could I be sure? "Hey, humor me a second here," I told her through the mic. "Tell me one thing about us. Just prove to me you're—" She gave the camera a weird look. All right," she said slowly, thinking. "We met randomly at a playground when we were both way too old to be there." I sighed deeply as reality returned and fear faded. God, I'd been so ridiculous. Of course it was Amy. That day wasn't anywhere in the world except in my memory. I'd never even mentioned it to anyone, not out of embarrassment, but out of a strange secret nostalgia and a longing for those days to return. If there was some unknown force at work trying to trick me, as I feared, there was no way they could know about that day. Ha ha ha. All right, I'll explain everything, I told her. Be right there. I ran to my small bathroom and fixed my hair as best I could. I looked like hell, but she would understand. Snickering at my own unbelievable behavior and the mess I'd made of the place, I walked to the door. I put my hand on the doorknob and gave the mess one last look. So ridiculous, I thought. My eyes traced over the half-eaten food lying on the ground, the overflowing trash bin, and the bed I'd tipped to the side looking for. God knows what. I almost turned to the door and opened it, but my eyes fell on one last thing, the old webcam, the one I used for that eerily vacant chat with my friend. Its silent black sphere lay haphazardly tossed to the side, its lens pointed, at the table where this journal lay. An overwhelming terror took me as I realized that if something could see through that camera, it would have seen what I just wrote about that day. I asked her for any one thing about us, and she chose the only thing in the world that I thought they or it did not know. But it did know. It could have been watching me the whole time. I didn't open the door. I screamed. I screamed in uncontrollable terror. I stomped on the old webcam on the floor. The door shook and the doorknob tried to turn, but I didn't hear Amy's voice through the door. Was the basement door made to keep out drafts too thick? Or was Amy not outside? What could have been trying to get in, if not her? What the hell is out there? I saw her on my computer through the camera outside. I heard her on the speakers through the camera outside, but was it real? How can I know? She's gone now. I screamed and shouted for help. I piled up everything in my apartment against the front door. Friday. At least I think that it's Friday. I broke everything electronic, smashed my computer to pieces. Every single thing on there could have been accessed by network access or worse, altered. I'm a programmer. I know. Every little piece of information I gave out since this started, my name, my email, my location, none of it came back from outside until I gave it out. I've been going over and over what I wrote. I've been pacing back and forth, alternating between stark terror and overpowering disbelief. Sometimes I'm absolutely certain some phantom entity is dead set on the simple goal of getting me to go outside. Back to the beginning with the phone call from Amy, she was effectively asking me to open the door and go outside. I keep running through it in my head. One point of view says I've acted like a madman, and all of this is the extreme convergence of probability. Never going outside at the right times by pure luck, never seeing another person by pure chance, getting a random nonsense email from some computer virus at just the right time. The other point of view says that extreme convergence of probability is the reason that whatever's out there hasn't gotten me already. I keep thinking, I never opened the window on the 3rd floor. I never opened the front door until that incredibly stupid stunt with the hidden camera, after which I ran straight to my room and slammed the door. I haven't opened my own solid door since I flung open the front door of the building. Whatever's out there, if anything's out there, never made an appearance in the building before I opened the front door. Maybe the reason it wasn't in the building already was that it was elsewhere, getting everyone else. And then it waited until I betrayed my existence by trying to call Amy. A call that didn't work until it called me and asked me my name. Terror literally overwhelms me every time I try to fit the pieces of this nightmare together. That email, short, cut off. Was it from someone trying to get the word out? Some friendly voice desperately trying to warn me before it came? Seen with my own eyes, I don't trust them. Exactly what I've been so suspicious of. It could have masterful control of all things electronic, practicing its insidious deception to trick me into coming outside. Why can't it get in? It knocked on the door. It must have some solid presence. The door, the image of those doors in the upper hallway, as guardian monoliths flashes back in my mind every time I trace this path of thoughts. If there is some phantom entity trying to get me to go outside, maybe it can't get through doors. I keep thinking back over all the books I've read or movies I've seen, trying to generate some explanation for this. Doors have always been such intense foci of human imagination, always seen as wards or portals of special importance. Or perhaps the door is just too thick. I know that I couldn't bash through any of the doors in this building, let alone the heavy basement ones. Aside from that, the real question is, why does it even want me? If it just wanted to kill me, it could do it in any number of ways, including just waiting until I starve to death. What if it doesn't want to kill me? What if it has some far more horrific fate in store for me? God, what can I do to escape this nightmare? A knock on the door. I told the people on the other side of the door I need a minute to think and I'll come out. I'm really just writing this down so I can figure out what to do. At least this time I heard their voices. My paranoia. And yes, I recognize I'm being paranoid, has me thinking of all sorts of ways that their voices could be faked electronically. There could be nothing but speakers outside, simulating human voices. Did it really take them 3 days to come talk to me? Amy is supposedly out there along with 2 policemen and a psychiatrist. Maybe it took them 3 days to think of what to say to me. The psychiatrist's claim could be pretty convincing if I decided to think this has all been a crazy misunderstanding and not some entity trying to trick me into opening the door. The psychiatrist had an older voice, authoritarian but still caring. I liked it. I'm desperate just to see someone with my own eyes. He said I have something called cyberpsychosis, and I'm just one of a nationwide epidemic of thousands of people having breakdowns triggered by a suggestive email that got through somehow. I swear he said, got through somehow. I think he means spread throughout the country inexplicably, but I'm incredibly suspicious that the entity slipped up and revealed something. He said I am part of a wave of emergent behavior, that a lot of other people are having the same problem with the same fears, even though we've never communicated. That neatly explains the strange email about eyes that I got. I didn't get the original triggering email. I got a descendant of it. My friend could have broken down too, and tried to warn everyone he knew against his paranoid fears. That's how the problem spreads, the psychiatrist claims. I could have spread it too, with my texts and instant messages online to everybody I know. One of those people might be melting down right now, after being triggered by something I sent them. Something they might interpret any way that they want. Something like a text saying, "Seen anyone face to face lately?" The psychiatrist told me that he didn't want to lose another one, that people like me are intelligent, and that's our downfall. We draw connections so well that we draw them even when they shouldn't be there. He said it's easy to get caught up in paranoia in our fast-paced world, a constantly changing place where more and more of our interaction is simulated. I have to give him one thing. It's a great explanation. It neatly explains everything. It perfectly explains everything, in fact. I have every reason to shake off this nightmarish fear that something or consciousness or being out there wants me to open the door so it can capture me for some horrible fate, worse than death. It would be foolish, after hearing that explanation, to stay in here until I starve to death, just to spite the entity that might have got everyone else. It would be foolish to think that, after hearing that explanation, I might be one of the last people left alive on an empty world, hiding in my secure basement room, spiting some unthinkable deceptive entity, just by refusing to be captured. It's a perfect explanation for every single strange thing I've seen or heard, and I have every reason in the world to let all of my fears go and open the door. That's exactly why I'm not going to. How can I be sure? How can I know what's real and what's deception? All of these damn things with their wires and their signals that originate from some unseen origin. They're not real. I can't be sure. Signals through a camera, faked video, deceptive phone, calls, emails, even the television lying broken on the floor. How can I possibly know it's real? It's just signals, waves, light, the door. It's banging on the door. It's trying to get in. What insane mechanical contrivance could it be using to simulate the sound of men attacking the heavy wood so well? At least I'll finally see it with my own eyes. There's nothing left in here for it to deceive me with. I've ripped apart everything else. It can't deceive my eyes, can it? Seen with your own eyes, don't trust them, Wait. Was that desperate message telling me to trust my eyes or warning me about my eyes too? Oh my God, what's the difference between a camera and my eyes? They both turn light into electrical signals. They're the same. I can't be deceived. I have to be sure. I have to be sure. I calmly asked for paper and a pen, day in and day out, until they finally gave them to me. Not that it matters. What am I going to do? Poke my eyes out? The bandages feel like part of me now. The pain is gone. I figure this will be one of my last chances to write legibly, as without my sight to correct mistakes, my hands will slowly forget the motions involved. This is a sort of self-indulgence, this writing. It's a relic of another time, because I'm certain everyone left in the world is dead, or something far worse. I sit against the padded wall day in and day out. The entity brings me food and water. It masks itself as a kind nurse, as an unsympathetic doctor. I think it knows that my hearing has sharpened considerably, now that I live in darkness. It fakes conversations in the hallways, on the off chance that I might overhear. One of the nurses talks about having a baby soon. One of the doctors lost his wife in a car accident. None of it matters. None of it is real. None of it gets to me, not like she does. That's the worst part, the part I almost can't handle. The thing comes to me, masquerading as Amy. It's recreation. It's perfect. It sounds exactly like Amy, feels exactly like her. It even produces a reasonable facsimile of tears that it makes me feel on its lifelike cheeks. When it first dragged me here, it told me all the things I wanted to hear. It told me that she loved me, that she had always loved me, that it didn't understand why I did this, that we could still have a life together if only I would stop insisting that I was being deceived. It wanted me to believe. No. It needed me to believe that she was real. I almost fell for it. I really did. I doubted myself for the longest time. In the end, though, it was all too perfect, too flawless, and too real. The false Amy used to come every day and then every week, and finally stopped coming altogether. But I don't think the entity will give up. I think the waiting game is just another one of its gambits. I will resist it for the rest of my life if I have to. I don't know what happened to the rest of the world, but I do know that this thing needs me to fall for its deceptions. If it needs that, then maybe, just maybe, I am a thorn in its agenda. Maybe Amy is still alive out there somewhere, kept alive only by my will to resist the deceiver. I hold on to that hope, rocking back and forth in my cell to pass the time. I will never give in. I will never break. I am a hero. The doctor read the paper the patient had scribbled on. It was barely readable, written in the shaky script of one who could not see. He wanted to smile at the man's steadfast resolve, a reminder of the human will to survive. But he knew that the patient was completely delusional. After all, a sane man would have fallen for the deception long ago. The doctor wanted to smile. He wanted to whisper words of encouragement to the delusional man. He wanted to scream, but the nerve filaments wrapped around his head and into his eyes made him do otherwise. His body walked into the cell like a puppet and told the patient once more that he was wrong and that there was nobody trying to deceive him.